The scalpel trembled in Margaret's hand as another child's fevered cry pierced the night. Outside the makeshift hospital, torches blazed against the Colorado darkness, while inside, the truth she'd hidden for months was about to explode. "Please, Doc Hale," the miner's wife begged, not knowing she was addressing the mail-order bride who'd fooled them all. Margaret looked at the dying children, then at James, standing in the doorway, the man who thought he'd married a schoolteacher. The epidemic would expose everything, but letting them die to protect her secret? That was no longer an option. Welcome to Timber Creek, where one woman's deception might be the town's only salvation. Stay with me until the end and comment your location. I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach lurched to a halt with a groan of protesting wood and leather, sending a cloud of dust billowing across the main street of Timber Creek, Colorado. Margaret Hale pressed a lace handkerchief to her nose, though the gesture was more habit than necessity. She'd breathed in far worse during her years in Boston's surgical wards. Through the settling dust, she glimpsed her future, a raw frontier town clinging to the base of the Rockies like a stubborn weed, refusing to be torn from the earth. October 1878 painted the mountains in shades of gold and rust, but Margaret saw only the gray uncertainty of her circumstances. Her gloved fingers tightened around the brass clasps of her trunk, the one piece of luggage that mattered, the one that held the instruments of a life she was supposed to have left behind. "Timber Creek!" the driver bellowed, though his announcement was unnecessary. This was the end of the line in more ways than one. Margaret gathered her traveling dress, a sensible navy wool that had seen her through the journey from Denver, and prepared to step into her new existence. The weight of her deception pressed against her ribs like a too-tight corset. She was no longer Dr. Margaret Hale, the woman who'd fought tooth and nail for her medical degree only to have it rendered worthless by scandal and lies. She was simply Margaret now, a mail-order bride come to marry James Rowland, proprietor of the town's general store. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years learning to save lives, and now she would spend the rest of hers pretending she hadn't. "Miss Hale." The voice startled her from her reverie. A man stood beside the coach, hat in hand, his face weathered but kind. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letters, broader in the shoulders, with premature silver threading through dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes, a striking gray-green like sage leaves after rain, studied her with an intensity that made her wonder what he saw. "Mr. Rowland," she said, allowing him to help her down from the coach. His hands were steady, calloused from honest work, and when he smiled, lines crinkled at the corners of his eyes. "James, please," he said, his voice carrying a slight Tennessee drawl that his letters hadn't conveyed. "I hope the journey wasn't too arduous." "Nothing I couldn't manage," Margaret replied, smoothing her skirts while mentally cataloging her first impression. James Rowland was handsome in a rugged way, with an air of quiet confidence that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. More importantly, he seemed genuinely pleased to see her, not disappointed that his mail-order bride wasn't a blushing young beauty. At 32, Margaret knew she was past the typical age for such arrangements. The silver threads in her own dark hair hastily hidden beneath her bonnet, and the fine lines earned from years of medical study marked her as a woman with a past. But James had specifically requested someone mature and educated in his advertisement, someone who could help with the store's accounts and perhaps teach the local children their letters. If only he knew just how educated she really was. "Let me get your belongings," James said, moving toward the luggage being unloaded from the coach's roof. When he reached for her trunk, Margaret's heart stuttered. "I'll take that one," she said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "It has delicate items. Personal things." James's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded without question, taking her other cases instead. "Of course. The store's just across the way. I've prepared rooms above. Nothing fancy, but comfortable enough. We can discuss arrangements once you've had time to settle." Margaret appreciated his delicacy. They both knew why she was here, but he wasn't presuming anything. Their correspondence had established a tentative friendship, though she'd been careful to omit certain crucial details about her past. He knew she was educated, that she'd worked as a governess in Boston, a lie that came easily, and that she sought a new start in the West, the complete truth. He didn't know about the medical degree from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, or the surgical residency at the New England Hospital for Women and Children, or the malicious accusations that had destroyed everything she'd worked for. As they walked down Timber Creek's main street, Margaret observed her new home with a physician's eye, though she tried to disguise her assessment as mere curiosity. The town was larger than she'd expected, boasting perhaps 800 souls if she included the miners who lived in camps on the mountain. The street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, lined with false-fronted buildings that gave an illusion of greater substance. She counted 2 saloons, a hotel that had seen better days, a blacksmith shop, a small bank, what appeared to be a newspaper office, and James's General Store, a 2-story structure that dominated the corner of Main and 2nd Streets. But it was the people who drew her trained gaze. A miner coughed wetly as he passed, the sound suggesting early-stage pneumoconiosis from dust inhalation. A pregnant woman waddled by, her gait indicating the baby had dropped. She'd deliver within the week, Margaret estimated. A child played with a hoop, favoring his left leg in a way that suggested an improperly healed fracture. "Doc Morrison tends to folks here," James said, noticing her attention to the limping child. "He's getting on in years, though. Sometimes has to ride out to the mining camps, and it takes a toll." Margaret filed this information away. An elderly doctor meant outdated techniques, limited supplies, and probably a reliance on laudanum and bloodletting over more modern treatments. Her fingers itched for her instruments, for the familiar weight of a scalpel, the satisfaction of a properly sutured wound. "And is there a midwife?" she asked, trying to sound merely conversational. "Mrs. Brennan, when she's sober," James said with a frown, "which isn't as often as folks would like. Lost a mother and baby last spring. Doc Morrison was out at the mines, and Mrs. Brennan—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Margaret's jaw clenched. Preventable deaths were the worst kind, the ones that haunted a physician's dreams. How many women had she delivered safely in Boston? How many difficult births had she navigated with steady hands and calm authority? And now she would stand by and watch while an incompetent midwife and an elderly doctor let people die? The thought was almost enough to make her turn around and catch the next stage back to Denver. Almost. "Here we are," James said, holding open the door to his store. A bell chimed overhead, a cheerful sound that seemed to mock Margaret's dark thoughts. "Welcome to Roland's General Goods," and, well, welcome home. The store's interior was neat and well organized, with shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from flour and coffee to ribbons and buttons. The smell of leather, tobacco, and pickles in brine created an oddly comforting atmosphere. Behind the counter, she spotted a ledger laid open, columns of numbers in precise handwriting, James's, she assumed. "Let me show you upstairs," he said, leading her through a curtained doorway to a narrow staircase. "I know this isn't what you're used to, coming from Boston and all." If only he knew what she was used to. The gleaming surgical theater, the rows of medical texts, the respect of her colleagues before it all came crashing down. The upstairs consisted of 4 rooms, a small parlor with 2 chairs and a worn settee, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove and a table for 2, and 2 bedrooms separated by the parlor. James set her cases in the larger bedroom, which held a brass bed with a quilted coverlet, a washstand, and a wardrobe. "This is yours," he said, a slight flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "I thought, that is, until we're properly married, if you still—" "I'll take the other room." His consideration touched her more than she expected. "Thank you, James. That's very gentlemanly." He shifted his weight, suddenly looking younger than his 40-odd years. "I want to be clear, Miss Hale. Margaret. I advertise for a wife, yes, but I'm not the kind of man who'd force anything. We can take time to know each other, make sure this is what we both want. The town thinks what it will, but what happens between us is our business." Margaret studied him, this man who was essentially a stranger, yet offered her more respect than many she'd known for years. "I appreciate that more than you know." He smiled then, genuine and warm. "You must be tired. I'll leave you to settle in. Supper's at 6, nothing fancy, but I've gotten fairly good at stew over the years. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I'll introduce you around town, show you the schoolhouse. The children are eager to meet their new teacher. Another role to play, another deception to maintain. I look forward to it," After James left, Margaret sat on the bed and finally allowed herself a moment of weakness. Her hands shook as she opened the trunk, revealing the hidden compartment beneath a false bottom. Her surgical instruments lay wrapped in oilcloth, scalpels, forceps, sutures, a stethoscope that had been a graduation gift from her mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell herself. Beneath those, her medical texts and journals, containing 5 years of carefully documented cases and procedures. She ran her fingers over the instruments, feeling their familiar weight. These tools had been extensions of her own hands once, as natural as breathing. Now they were contraband, evidence of a life she couldn't claim. A knock at the door made her heart leap. She quickly closed the trunk, smoothing her dress as she called out, "Yes?" "Sorry to disturb," James's voice came through the door. "But there's someone here who insisted on meeting you right away. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell. She's the banker's wife and considers herself the town's social director." Margaret suppressed a groan. Of course there would be a Mrs. Hartwell. Every town had one, a woman who made it her business to know everyone else's business. She would have to be especially careful around such a person. "I'll be right down," she called, quickly checking her appearance in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked tired but presentable, every inch the respectable schoolteacher she was pretending to be. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell was exactly what Margaret expected. A woman in her 50s with steel gray hair arranged in an elaborate style that had been fashionable a decade ago, wearing a dress with enough ribbons and frills to stock James's entire notions section. Her sharp blue eyes assessed Margaret from bonnet to boots, cataloging every detail for later gossip. "Miss Hale," she said, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness of someone used to getting her way through manipulation rather than directness. "How wonderful to finally meet you. James has been quite mysterious about his correspondence with you." "Mrs. Hartwell," Margaret replied with a carefully measured smile. "How kind of you to welcome me." "Oh, we must look after each other here on the frontier, Mrs." Hartwell said, though her tone suggested that looking after meant keeping tabs on. "I understand you were a governess in Boston." "Yes, for several years." The lie came smoothly now, practiced during the long journey west. "And what family did you serve?" "Perhaps I know of them. My cousin married a Boston banker, you see." "A test, then." Mrs. Hartwell was fishing for information, trying to verify Margaret's story. "The Weatherbys," Margaret said, naming a real family she'd treated. The mother had suffered from chronic migraines. They lived on Beacon Hill, though I believe they've since moved to Philadelphia. "Ah," Mrs. Hartwell said, clearly disappointed that she couldn't immediately verify or dispute the claim. "And what brings a refined woman such as yourself to our humble town?" James stepped in then, bless him. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sure Miss Hale would be happy to answer all your questions once she's had time to rest from her journey." Of course," Mrs. Hartwell said, though her eyes remained fixed on Margaret. "I'm hosting a ladies' tea tomorrow afternoon. You simply must come, my dear. 2 o'clock sharp. It will give you a chance to meet all the respectable women in town." A command disguised as an invitation. Margaret recognized the politics at play. Refuse, and she'd be marked as standoffish. Accept, and she'd be subjected to intense scrutiny from the town's gossip network. "How thoughtful," Margaret said. "I'd be delighted." Mrs. Hartwell preened. "Wonderful. I'll introduce you to everyone who matters, including Mrs. Morrison, the doctor's wife. She helps him with his practice, you know, claims to have some nursing experience from the war." Her tone suggested skepticism about these claims. "Though between you and me, she's getting quite frail." "They both are. It's a worry, really, having only one doctor for the whole town, and him nearly 70. Margaret's pulse quickened. This was valuable intelligence, even if it came wrapped in gossip. "That does sound concerning. Back in Boston, we had so many physicians." "Yes, the conveniences of civilization," Mrs. Hartwell sighed dramatically. "Still, we make do. We're hardy stock out here. We have to be." Her eyes sharpened again. "Tell me, do you have any experience with nursing?" It would be such a help to poor Mrs. Morrison. A trap or genuine inquiry? Margaret couldn't tell. "Only what any governess learns tending childhood ailments, basic first aid, nothing formal." "Pity," Mrs. Hartwell said, though she looked relieved rather than disappointed. Perhaps she didn't want competition for her position as the town's most important woman. Well, I must be going. So much to prepare for tomorrow's tea. Don't forget, 2 o'clock sharp. The house with the green shutters on Pine Street. You can't miss it. After she left, James let out a long breath. I should have warned you about Adelaide. She means well, but she's a force of nature, Margaret finished. I've met the type before. She'll have you married off and producing children within the month if you let her, James said with a wry smile. She's been trying to run my life since I arrived 3 years ago. Only 3 years? You're not originally from Timber Creek? No, came out from Tennessee after the war. Needed a fresh start. Something in his tone suggested a story there, perhaps a painful one. Margaret didn't press. She had her own painful stories, after all. Well, she said, I suppose we're both refugees of a sort. He looked at her with those sage green eyes, seeming to see more than she intended to reveal. I suppose we are. The evening passed quietly. James's stew was indeed quite good, hearty and well-seasoned with chunks of beef and vegetables from the small garden he maintained behind the store. They ate in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging observations about the town or questions about each other's preferences. Did she take sugar in her coffee? Did he prefer biscuits or cornbread? It was oddly domestic, this careful dance around each other. Margaret found herself relaxing slightly, though she remained aware of the trunk upstairs with its dangerous secrets. Tell me about the school, she said as they cleared the dishes. How many children? About 20, ranging from 6 to 16. Some of the miners' children come when they can, but it's not regular. The previous teacher left to get married. Seems to be an occupational hazard for schoolmarms out here. He smiled at the irony, given her own situation. Can you really teach? I mean, that wasn't just something you said to make myself sound respectable? Margaret finished. No, I can teach. I'm well versed in arithmetic, geography, history, Latin, and the sciences. She caught herself before adding anatomy and physiology to the list. Latin? James raised an eyebrow. That's more than most teachers know. My father believed in thorough education, even for daughters, she said, which was true. Her father had been a progressive minister who'd supported her medical ambitions until his death 5 years ago. He sounds like an interesting man. He was. The past tense hung between them, and James didn't push for more information. That night, Margaret lay in the brass bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Timber Creek settling into sleep. A dog barked somewhere. Piano music and raucous laughter drifted from one of the saloons. The building creaked and settled, wood adjusting to the cool mountain night. She thought about the child with the limp, the miner with the cough, the pregnant woman due to deliver soon. All people who might need her skills, her real skills, not the pretend accomplishments of a governess-turned-schoolteacher. How long could she stand by and watch if someone needed help? How long could she pretend to be less than she was? In Boston, she'd been Dr. Margaret Hale, one of only a handful of female physicians in the entire city. She'd fought for every patient, every opportunity to prove that a woman could be just as capable as any man in the operating theater. And she'd been succeeding, building a reputation, earning grudging respect from even the most skeptical colleagues. Then came William Ashford. She closed her eyes against the memory, but it came anyway. William had been a fellow physician, charming and ambitious, who'd courted her with promises of a partnership in medicine and marriage. She'd been fool enough to believe him, to trust him with her research on antiseptic procedures that could reduce post-surgical infections. He'd stolen her work, published it under his name, and when she'd confronted him, he'd accused her of hysteria and inappropriate advances. The medical board had believed him, of course. Why wouldn't they? He was from an established Boston family, while she was just an upstart woman who'd gotten above herself. They'd revoked her hospital privileges, and though they couldn't take her degree, they'd made it clear she'd never practice in Boston again. So here she was, in a frontier town that needed a doctor, but got a schoolteacher instead. The irony was bitter as laudanum. A crash from outside brought her bolt upright. Shouts followed, then running feet. She was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move, peering down at the street below. 2 men were carrying a third between them, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Even from here, she could see the white of bone protruding through torn fabric, compound fracture of the tibia, her mind automatically catalogued. Needs immediate cleaning and setting or infection will set in. Where was Doc Morrison? She watched as they carried the injured man toward a building down the street, the doctor's office, presumably. Light bloomed in the windows and she could see shadows moving inside. The urge to go down, to help, was almost overwhelming. Her hands knew exactly what to do, how to clean the wound with carbolic acid, how to set the bone, how to suture the torn flesh with tiny, precise stitches that would minimize scarring. But she couldn't. She was Margaret Hale, school teacher and mail-order bride. Not Dr. Hale, not anymore. She turned away from the window and forced herself back to bed, though sleep eluded her for hours. When she finally dozed, she dreamed of surgeries, of saving lives, of the satisfaction of a successfully treated patient. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the taste of loss in her mouth. The next morning brought new challenges. James introduced her to the school, a one-room building with a pot-bellied stove, rough benches, and a handful of worn McGuffey readers. The children were a mix of ages and abilities, some eager to learn, others clearly there only because their parents insisted. "Children, this is Miss Hale," James announced. "She's come all the way from Boston to teach you." 20 pairs of eyes fixed on her with varying degrees of interest and suspicion. Margaret had faced down hostile medical boards and skeptical professors. Surely she could handle a room full of children. "Good morning," she said, putting warmth into her voice. "I'm excited to get to know all of you. Why don't we start by each of you telling me your name and one thing you'd like to learn this year?" A small girl with pigtails raised her hand immediately. "I'm Lucy Morrison. Doc Morrison is my grandpa. I want to learn to read better so I can help him with his medical books." Margaret's heart clenched. "That's a wonderful goal, Lucy." The introductions continued. Tommy, who wanted to learn arithmetic to help in his father's store, Sarah, who wanted to read poetry, young Michael, who just wanted to learn to write his name. Each child was a small story, a potential waiting to unfold. She threw herself into teaching with the same intensity she'd once brought to medicine. If she couldn't heal bodies, at least she could nurture minds. The children responded well to her enthusiasm, even the reluctant ones gradually warming to her approach. But it was during the lunch break that her two worlds nearly collided. She was eating the sandwich James had packed for her when Lucy Morrison approached, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Miss Hale," the girl said quietly, "can I show you something?" Margaret nodded, and Lucy unwrapped what turned out to be a small bird with a clearly broken wing. "I found it this morning," Lucy said, tears threatening. "Grandpa says it's too small to bother with, but I thought, you seem kind. Do you know how to help it?" Every instinct screamed at Margaret to help. She knew exactly how to set the delicate bone, how to create a tiny splint that would allow it to heal properly, but that would reveal knowledge a governess shouldn't have. She started, then saw the hope in Lucy's eyes. "Let me see." She took the bird gently, feeling along the wing with practiced fingers. A clean break, relatively simple. Before she could stop herself, she was instructing Lucy to fetch small twigs and thread from the sewing basket. "How do you know how to do this?" Lucy asked as Margaret deftly created a miniature splint. "I had a friend who was interested in natural philosophy," Margaret said carefully. "She showed me some things about anatomy." It was a weak explanation, but Lucy was too focused on the bird to question it. Margaret showed her how to feed it water from a dropper, how to handle it gently to avoid further injury. "You're good at this," Lucy said with the directness of youth. "Better than Mrs. Brennan when she tried to help Tommy's broken finger last year. She just wrapped it up all crooked, and now it doesn't bend right." Margaret's jaw tightened, another preventable injury improperly treated. How many more were there in this town? That afternoon, she attended Mrs. Hartwell's tea as promised. The banker's house was indeed impressive by frontier standards, 2 stories with real glass windows and those promised green shutters. The parlor was crowded with women in their best dresses, the air thick with perfume and gossip. Margaret was introduced around like a prize at a fair. Mrs. Morrison was there, a frail woman with intelligent eyes who studied Margaret with more perception than the others. Mrs. Brennan, the midwife, was notably absent, sleeping off a hangover, someone whispered. "Tell us about Boston," one woman gushed. "It must be so sophisticated compared to here." Margaret gave them sanitized stories of concerts and museums, carefully avoiding any mention of hospitals or medical lectures. But Mrs. Morrison kept watching her, and finally, when the others were distracted by Mrs. Hartwell's dramatic recounting of some scandal involving a miner's wife, she moved closer to Margaret. "You have careful hands," she said quietly. "I noticed when you were holding your teacup. You hold it like my husband holds his instruments, precise, controlled." Margaret's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "I was taught proper deportment from a young age." Mrs. Morrison didn't look convinced. "My husband could use help sometimes. Nothing medical, of course, but organizing supplies, keeping records. Would you be interested? The school only meets 3 days a week, after all." It was dangerous putting herself that close to medical practice. But it was also an opportunity to assess what medical supplies were available, to perhaps subtly influence treatments without revealing herself. "I'd be happy to help where I can," she said carefully. Mrs. Morrison smiled, a knowing expression that made Margaret wonder exactly what the older woman suspected. The weeks that followed established a routine. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she taught school. Tuesday and Thursday, she helped at Doc Morrison's office, filing, organizing, pretending not to understand the medical texts she could have recited from memory. Evenings were spent with James, growing more comfortable with each other, though they maintained separate bedrooms. James was proving to be more than she'd expected. He was intelligent, well-read, and surprisingly progressive in his views. He supported her teaching, even when some of the men grumbled about her including girls in mathematics lessons. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh when she least expected it. "Why did you really come west?" she asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. He was quiet for a long moment. "My wife died in Tennessee. Cholera. After that, nothing there felt right anymore. I needed to be somewhere that didn't remind me of her every day." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. "It was 6 years ago. The grief has softened into something bearable." He looked at her. "Why did you really leave Boston?" She'd prepared for this question, but sitting there with his honest eyes on her, she found herself wanting to tell the truth. Almost. "There was a man," she said, which was true. "He betrayed my trust, made it impossible for me to stay." James nodded, not pushing for details. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Running from ghosts." "Running towards something, I hope," she said. He smiled. "I hope so too." It was the pregnant woman who finally tested Margaret's resolve. She'd noticed the woman, Mrs. Patterson, the blacksmith's wife, growing larger each week, noticed too the exhaustion in her face, the swelling in her ankles that spoke of complications. 3 weeks into Margaret's time in Timber Creek, she was walking past the blacksmith shop when she heard screaming. Without thinking, she rushed inside to find Mrs. Patterson on the floor, clutching her belly, blood pooling beneath her skirts. "The baby," Mrs. Patterson gasped. "It's too early." "Only 7 months." Mr. Patterson was frozen with panic. "Doc Morrison's out at the mines, won't be back until tomorrow, and Mrs. Brennan is drunk," his assistant finished. "Saw her passed out behind the saloon an hour ago." Margaret knelt beside the woman, her hands automatically going to check the position of the baby. Breach she could tell immediately, and the bleeding suggested placental abruption. Without immediate intervention, both mother and child would die. "Get clean water boiling," she ordered, her doctor's authority breaking through her careful facade. "And bring clean linens, as many as you can find. Now!" The men scrambled to obey, too panicked to question why the schoolteacher was taking charge. "Listen to me," Margaret told Mrs. Patterson, using her calm physician's voice. "Your baby is turned wrong, and you're bleeding. I need to help you, but you have to trust me. Can you do that?" Mrs. Patterson nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, save my baby." Margaret made her decision. She couldn't let them die to protect her secret. "Mr. Patterson, send someone to my room above the store. In my trunk, the one with the brass corners, there's a black leather bag. Bring it immediately." As the blacksmith ran off, Margaret began assessing the situation more thoroughly. The bleeding was significant but not catastrophic, yet. If she could turn the baby and deliver it quickly, they had a chance. James appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. His eyes widened at the scene. Margaret, with her hands covered in blood, calmly issuing orders. Margaret. Not now, James, she said firmly. Just help me. He nodded and moved to follow her instructions without question. When Patterson returned with her medical bag, Margaret didn't hesitate. She pulled out her instruments, the ones she'd thought she'd never use again, and set to work. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of careful manipulation to turn the baby, of monitoring the mother's pulse and breathing, of using every skill she'd learned in 5 years of training and practice. The baby came out blue and still, the cord wrapped around its neck. Margaret quickly cleared its airway, rubbing its chest vigorously while silently counting seconds. Come on, breathe. Finally, a weak cry filled the room, and everyone exhaled at once. She's small but strong, Margaret said, wrapping the baby and handing her to the exhausted mother. You'll both need careful monitoring, but I believe you'll recover well. It was only then, as the immediate crisis passed, that she realized what she'd done. The room was full of witnesses: James, Mr. Patterson, his assistant, 2 neighbor women who'd appeared at some point. They all stared at her with expressions ranging from awe to suspicion. You're a doctor, Mrs. Morrison said from the doorway. No one had noticed her arrival, but she stood there with knowing satisfaction on her face. I suspected as much. Margaret straightened, blood still on her hands, and met their gazes steadily. Yes, I was. I trained at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania and practiced in Boston until circumstances forced me to leave. Why hide it? James asked, his voice carefully neutral. Because female physicians aren't welcome most places, Mr. Rowland. Because the medical board in Boston made it clear I would never practice again. Because I thought I could start over as something else, something acceptable. She laughed bitterly. I lasted all of 3 weeks. Mrs. Hartwell pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with indignation. This is outrageous. You've been lying to us all, pretending to be a respectable woman when you're a trained physician who just saved 2 lives? Mrs. Morrison interrupted sharply. Yes, how scandalous. Women aren't meant to be doctors, Mrs. Hartwell insisted. It's unnatural, improper. Would you rather Mrs. Patterson and her baby had died? Margaret asked quietly. Because that's what would have happened. The baby was breech with the cord around her neck, and Mrs. Patterson was hemorrhaging. Even if Doc Morrison had been here with his shaking hands and failing eyesight, could he have managed such a delicate procedure? The room fell silent. It was a harsh truth, but truth nonetheless. Mr. Patterson stepped forward. I don't care if you're a woman or a 3-headed dragon. You saved my wife and daughter. That's all that matters to me. But the impropriety, Mrs. Hartwell started. Adelaide, shut up, Mrs. Morrison said with surprising force. My husband is old and tired. We've needed real help for months. If Miss Hale, Dr. Hale, is willing to provide it, then we should be grateful, not scandalized. Margaret looked at James, trying to read his expression. He'd been silent since her revelation, and she couldn't tell if he was angry, disappointed, or something else entirely. I think, he said slowly, that we all need time to think about this. Dr. Hale has just performed a miracle. Let's be grateful for that tonight and discuss the rest tomorrow. People began to disperse, though the whispers started immediately. Margaret cleaned her instruments methodically, trying not to think about what she'd just lost. Her new life, her chance at anonymity, possibly her opportunity for marriage, all gone in 2 hours of blood and honesty. Margaret. James's voice made her look up. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. We need to talk. She followed him back to the store in silence. The weight of her medical bag felt heavier than it had in months. In the parlor above the store, James poured 2 glasses of whiskey, a measure of how serious he considered the situation. Tell me everything, he said, the truth this time. So she did. She told him about her father encouraging her education, about the fight to get into medical school, about the years of being the only woman in lectures where professors questioned whether females had the mental capacity for science. She told him about gradually earning respect through sheer determination and skill, and finally, she told him about William Ashford. He was charming and seemed to support my work, she said, staring into her whiskey. I developed new techniques for preventing infection after surgery, methods that could save countless lives. I shared my research with him, thinking we were partners. Instead, he published it under his name. When I protested, he claimed I was a hysteric woman who developed an unhealthy attachment to him. He had friends on the medical board, and they believed him. They revoked my hospital privileges and made it clear that if I tried to practice in Boston again, they'd have me arrested for fraud. James was quiet for a long moment. So you answered a mail-order bride advertisement. I thought I could disappear. Become someone else, be a normal woman with a normal life. She laughed bitterly. I couldn't even last a month. No, James said, and something in his tone made her look up. You couldn't stand by and watch people die when you could help. That's not a failing, Margaret. That's character. It's also the end of any chance we had, she said quietly. You advertised for a wife, not a scandal. James set down his glass and moved to sit beside her. I advertised for a partner, someone intelligent and capable. I'd say I got more than I bargained for. James, do you know why I really left Tennessee? He interrupted. My wife didn't die of cholera. She killed herself. She was melancholic, they said, but I think now she was just desperately unhappy. She wanted to paint, to create art, but everyone told her that was foolish, that she should focus on being a wife and mother, so she did, and it slowly killed her spirit until she decided to kill her body too. Margaret reached for his hand instinctively. James, I'm so sorry. I swore if I ever married again, it would be to a woman who was fully herself, not some shadow of what society expected. He squeezed her hand. You're a doctor, Margaret. That's extraordinary. Why would I want you to be less than you are? Tears burned her eyes. The town won't accept it. Mrs. Hartwell's opinion matters less than you think. The Pattersons will support you. Mrs. Morrison will support you. And I'll support you, he paused. If you'll still have me, that is. I understand if a shopkeeper isn't what you want now that you don't have to hide. Margaret looked at this man who'd just learned she'd lied to him for weeks and was more concerned about whether she still wanted him. You're so much more than a shopkeeper, James Rowland. He smiled then, that warm smile that had become dear to her. And you're so much more than I ever dared hope for. The next morning brought the reckoning Margaret had expected. She woke to find a crowd gathered outside the store, voices raised in argument. Through the window she could see the town divided. Mrs. Hartwell and her faction on one side, the Pattersons and, surprisingly, several miners' wives on the other. We should run her out of town, Mrs. Hartwell was declaring. She's a fraud and a liar. She saved my wife and daughter, Mr. Patterson shot back. That's worth more than your propriety. Doc Morrison stood between the groups, looking every one of his 70 years. When he saw Margaret at the window, he raised a hand for silence. I'd like to speak with Dr. Hale, he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of service to the town. Alone. Margaret dressed quickly and went down to meet him. He was in the store examining her medical bag with professional interest. These are fine instruments, he said without preamble. Better than most of mine. They were a graduation gift, she said carefully. He nodded. From the Women's Medical College. I've heard of it. Dr. Ann Preston was the dean, wasn't she? A formidable woman, by all accounts. You're not scandalized? He laughed, a rusty sound. My dear, I'm too old and tired to be scandalized. I've been praying for help for 2 years. I didn't specify what form that help should take. He studied her. You handled a breech birth with placental bleeding. That's not easy even for an experienced physician. I've delivered dozens of babies, including complicated births. And surgery? Can you handle surgery? Yes, I was particularly interested in antiseptic techniques. She caught herself. Though I suppose that doesn't matter now. On the contrary. Doc Morrison pulled out a chair and sat heavily. I'm 71 years old, Dr. Hale. My hands shake, my eyes are failing, and I can barely make the ride to the mining camps anymore. This town needs a real doctor, and frankly, I don't care if that doctor wears trousers or petticoats as long as they can save lives. The town won't accept me. Some won't, he agreed, but more will, especially when the alternative is no doctor at all. I'm proposing a partnership. You work with me officially. We'll say you're my assistant if that makes people feel better, but we'll both know the truth. I'll lend you respectability, and you'll do the actual doctoring. And when they realize I'm doing most of the work, by then, they'll be used to it. People are practical out here, Dr. Hale. They care more about results than propriety, whatever Adelaide Hartwell might say. He stood with effort. Think about it. But don't think too long. Mrs. Chen is due to deliver twins any day now, and I haven't successfully delivered twins in 5 years. After he left, James found Margaret standing in the middle of the store, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "He called me Dr. Hale," she whispered. "It's been 6 months since anyone called me that with respect instead of mockery." James pulled her into his arms, and she let herself be held, let herself feel the solid warmth of this man who accepted all of her, not just the convenient parts. The town meeting that evening was contentious. Mrs. Hartwell had rallied her supporters, about a third of the town who felt that Margaret's deception and her profession were equally scandalous. But more people spoke in her favor, not just the Pattersons, but others who'd heard about the successful delivery, who remembered other times when Doc Morrison had been unavailable and someone had died who might have been saved. "She lied to us," Mrs. Hartwell insisted. "She told the same half-truths any woman in her position would tell," Mrs. Morrison countered. "How many of us have hidden parts of ourselves to be acceptable? How many of us have talents we don't use because they're not considered proper?" That struck a chord with many of the women, Margaret noticed. She saw recognition in their faces, the remembered pain of dreams deferred. It was young Lucy Morrison who provided the turning point. The girl stood up, clutching something in her hands. "Miss Hale, Doctor Hale, fix this," she said, holding up the bird with its splinted wing. "It's healing perfect." She knew just what to do. And she taught me about bones and muscles and how bodies work. I want to be a doctor someday, like her and Grandpa. She looked defiantly at Mrs. Hartwell. "Why shouldn't I if I'm smart enough and work hard enough?" "Because you're a girl," Mrs. Hartwell started. "So?" Lucy interrupted with the fearlessness of youth. "Dr. Hale's a girl, and she saved Mrs. Patterson and the baby. Maybe being a girl makes her better at some things. Maybe that's why God sent her here, because he knew we needed her." Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret thought, watching the crowd react to Lucy's words. The unofficial vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. Margaret could stay and practice medicine, though she would officially be Doc Morrison's assistant to maintain some veneer of propriety. Mrs. Hartwell huffed and declared she would never seek treatment from that woman, but most people seemed relieved to have another medical option. "You realize," James said that evening as they sat on the porch, "this changes things between us." Margaret's heart sank. "I understand if you no longer want—" he interrupted, "that you're not dependent on marriage now. You can support yourself as a doctor. So if we marry, it will be because we choose each other, not because you need protection or I need a housekeeper." She looked at him in surprise. "You still want to marry me?" "More than ever," he said simply. "The question is, do you want to marry me? Now that you don't have to?" Margaret thought about the past 3 weeks, about the quiet evenings and shared meals, about his steady support and dry humor, about the way he'd stood by her when her secret was revealed. "Yes," she said, "I choose you, James Rowland. Not because I have to, but because I want to." He kissed her then, their first real kiss, and it was tender and promising and tasted like the beginning of something true. But even as she melted into his embrace, Margaret knew their challenges were far from over. Mrs. Hartwell and her faction wouldn't give up easily. There would be resistance to her practicing medicine, attempts to undermine her at every turn. And somewhere to the east, William Ashford still had her research, still claimed credit for her work. But she had James now, and Doc Morrison's support, and a town that, mostly, was willing to give her a chance. It was more than she'd had in Boston, more than she'd dared hope for when she'd stepped off that stagecoach 3 weeks ago. That night, as she organized her medical supplies in Doc Morrison's office, her office too now, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a woman running from disaster, but the steady hope of someone building something new. The pregnant Chinese woman Doc Morrison had mentioned came in the next morning, and Margaret examined her carefully. Twins, indeed, and both positioned well. With proper care, the delivery should go smoothly. Mrs. Chen was nervous about being treated by a woman doctor, but her husband was pragmatic. "You saved Patterson baby," he said in accented but clear English. "That all I need know." As Margaret prepared her treatment plan, she realized this was her chance to prove herself not in a crisis, but in ordinary practice. If she could build trust one patient at a time, eventually even Mrs. Hartwell's resistance would crumble. But she'd barely finished with Mrs. Chen when young Tommy burst into the office, face flushed with panic. "Dr. Hale, come quick! There's been an accident at the mine!" Margaret grabbed her medical bag without hesitation, the weight of it familiar and urgent in her hands. Tommy was already running back toward the mine, and she followed, her skirts hampering her speed. James appeared from the store, saw her running, and fell into step beside her without question. "How many injured?" she called to Tommy as they ran. "Don't know." Maybe 5, maybe more. The support beam gave way in Tunnel 3. The mine entrance was chaos when they arrived. Men covered in coal dust milled about, some supporting injured companions, others shouting orders that nobody seemed to be following. Margaret pushed through the crowd, her medical training taking over. "I need the injured laid out here, in the light," she commanded, pointing to a clear area. "Walking wounded to the left, serious injuries to the right. Someone start boiling water and I need clean cloth for bandages, sheets, shirts, anything." The miners, desperate for someone to take charge, obeyed immediately. Within minutes, she had 7 injured men arranged by severity. Doc Morrison arrived, wheezing from the exertion, and she quickly briefed him. 2 critical, 1 with a crushed chest, another with a head wound and unconsciousness. 3 with broken bones I can handle, 2 with lacerations requiring sutures. Doc Morrison nodded, moving to the head injury while she tackled the crushed chest. The man, she recognized him as Sean O'Brien, one of the Irish workers, was struggling to breathe, his chest moving asymmetrically. "Flail chest," she diagnosed quickly. "Multiple rib fractures causing paradoxical breathing." She turned to James. "I need you to hold this section of his chest stable while I work." James didn't hesitate, placing his hands where she directed. Margaret worked swiftly, stabilizing the chest wall and clearing the airway. O'Brien's breathing eased, though she knew he'd need careful monitoring for internal injuries. "Mary, Mother of God," O'Brien wheezed when he could speak. "The school teacher's gone and saved me life." "Doctor," James corrected firmly. "Dr. Hale saved your life." Margaret moved on to the next patient, setting bones with swift efficiency. The miners watched with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Many had never seen a woman in command like this, certainly not one up to her elbows in blood and coal dust. It was while she was suturing a gash on a young miner's forehead that she heard the commotion. Mrs. Hartwell had arrived with her contingent, presumably to offer Christian comfort to the injured. Instead, she stood aghast at the scene of Margaret performing medicine in full view of half the town. "This is indecent," she declared. "These men are half-dressed, and she's touching them." "Would you prefer they die fully clothed?" Margaret asked without looking up from her sutures. "Because that can certainly be arranged if you'd like to take over their care." Several miners laughed despite their pain. Big Tom McKenna, waiting his turn with a broken arm, spoke up. "No offense, Mrs. Hartwell, but I'll take the doc who knows what she's doing over propriety any day." "She's not a real doctor," Mrs. Hartwell insisted. "Real enough for me," O'Brien gasped from his stretcher. "Real enough to keep me breathing when me chest was caved in." The argument might have continued, but a new crisis emerged. A woman's scream echoed from the direction of town, high and terrified. Margaret's head snapped up, recognizing the particular quality of that scream. A woman in childbirth, and something was wrong. "Go," Doc Morrison said, looking up from his patient. "I can finish here. That sounds like Mrs. Chen." Margaret ran again, her medical bag banging against her hip. The Chinese section of town was only 3 streets over, but it seemed like miles. She found Mrs. Chen's house by the crowd gathered outside and pushed her way in. The scene inside was chaotic. Mrs. Chen was on the floor, surrounded by women speaking rapid Chinese. There was blood, too much blood, and Margaret could see immediately that one twin had been partially delivered but was stuck. "Everyone out except for one person to translate," she ordered. The authority in her voice transcended language barriers, and the room cleared except for Mrs. Chen's sister, who spoke better English. "First baby come quick," the sister explained, "but second baby won't come." She pushing and pushing, but nothing. Margaret examined Mrs. Chen quickly and carefully. The second twin was transverse, lying sideways across the womb. Without intervention, both mother and child would die. "Tell her I need to turn the baby," Margaret said to the sister. "It will hurt, but I can save them both." As the sister translated, Margaret prepared for one of the most difficult procedures in obstetrics. She'd done it twice before in Boston, both times successfully, but never without another doctor present. "James?" she called, knowing he would have followed her. He appeared immediately. "I need you to hold her shoulders. Keep her as still as possible." He nodded, moving into position without question. Margaret appreciated his steady presence, his complete trust in her abilities despite having learned the truth about her only days ago. The procedure was excruciating for Mrs. Chen, who screamed and cursed in Chinese while Margaret carefully manipulated the baby into position. Sweat dripped into her eyes, but she didn't dare stop to wipe it away. Finally, she felt the baby turn, head moving down into the birth canal. "Now push," she urged, and the sister translated. "Push hard." The second twin emerged in a rush of fluid and blood, smaller than the first, but crying immediately. A good sign. Margaret quickly cut the cord and handed the baby to the sister while she dealt with the afterbirth and checked for excessive bleeding. Only when both babies were nursing and Mrs. Chen's bleeding had stopped did Margaret allow herself to slump with exhaustion. She'd been working for 3 hours straight, first at the mine and now here. "You are a miracle," Mrs. Chen whispered in broken English, tears streaming down her face. "You saved my babies." Mr. Chen, who had been pacing outside, fell to his knees when he saw his wife and 2 healthy sons. He grabbed Margaret's bloody hands and kissed them, speaking rapid Chinese that needed no translation. Gratitude was universal. As Margaret emerged from the house, she found a crowd had gathered. Word of the mine rescue and the successful twin delivery had spread. People looked at her differently now, not with suspicion or scandal, but with respect and something approaching awe. "3 lives at the mine, 3 lives here," someone murmured. 6 souls saved in one morning. Even some of Mrs. Hartwell's supporters looked shaken in their convictions. It was hard to argue against results, especially when those results were living, breathing people who would have died without Margaret's intervention. Doc Morrison was waiting at his office when she returned. He looked exhausted but satisfied. "All the miners will survive," he reported, "though O'Brien will need careful watching." He studied her with professional appreciation. "That was fine work today, Dr. Hale. Very fine work." "I had good training," she said modestly. "No," he corrected. "You have good instincts. Training only takes you so far. The rest is natural talent, and you have it in abundance." That evening, James insisted she rest while he brought her supper. They sat in the parlor above the store, and Margaret realized her hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed. "Delayed reaction," she explained, seeing his concern. "It happens after intensive procedures." "You were magnificent," he said simply. "I've never seen anything like it. The way you took command, the way you saved those lives." "It's what I was trained to do," she said, but his praise warmed her. "No, it's who you are," he corrected. "I watched you. You weren't thinking about being proper or acceptable. You were just being yourself fully and completely. It was beautiful." She looked at him, this man who saw her so clearly. "Most men would be intimidated by a wife who could do what I did today." "Most men are fools," James said. "I'm proud of you, Margaret. Proud to know you, proud to stand beside you, proud that you've chosen me." The weight of the day suddenly crashed over her, and she found herself crying, not from sadness but from relief. For months she'd hidden who she was, pretended to be less than she was. Today, she'd been herself completely, and instead of rejection, she'd found acceptance. James moved to sit beside her, pulling her against his shoulder. She let herself lean into his strength, let herself be vulnerable with this man who had proven himself worthy of her trust. "Marry me," he said suddenly. "Not in a month or when things settle down. This week." I don't want to wait anymore." She pulled back to look at him. "James, the scandal will exist whether we're married or not. But if we're married, you'll have legal protection. A husband's rights over his wife might be archaic, but they could protect you if anyone tries to challenge your right to practice medicine." It was practical, but she heard the emotion underneath. He wanted her as his wife not for convenience, but for love. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you this week." He kissed her then, deeper than before, and she felt desire spark between them. But before things could progress, another crisis interrupted, a pounding on the store door and urgent voices calling for the doctor. "It never stops," Margaret said with a rueful smile. "No," James agreed, helping her to her feet. "But that's why you're needed here." The emergency was a child with a high fever, possibly scarlet fever. Margaret spent the night treating him with cool baths and willow bark tea, teaching his mother how to manage the fever. By dawn, the crisis had passed, and the child was sleeping peacefully. Walking back to the store as the sun rose over the mountains, Margaret felt something shift inside her. This was her life now. Not the life she'd planned, but perhaps the life she was meant to have. No more hiding, no more pretending. She was Dr. Margaret Hale, soon to be Dr. Margaret Rowland, and Timber Creek was her home. The wedding took place 3 days later in the small church, with Doc Morrison giving her away and half the town in attendance. Mrs. Hartwell and her faction notably absent, but Margaret didn't care. The people who mattered were there: the Pattersons with their healthy baby, Mrs. Chen with her twins, the miners she'd saved, the children from the school. Lucy Morrison served as her bridesmaid, beaming with pride. "When I grow up, I'm going to be just like you," she whispered as she adjusted Margaret's veil, a simple affair borrowed from Mrs. Morrison. "You'll be better," Margaret whispered back. "You won't have to hide who you are." The ceremony was simple but moving. James had written his own vows, promising to support her in all her endeavors, to stand beside her against any criticism, and to love her not despite her unusual profession, but because of the dedication and compassion it represented. Margaret's vows were equally personal. "You saw who I truly was, even when I was hiding it," she said, looking into his sage green eyes. "You gave me the courage to be myself again. I promise to love you with the same fierce dedication I bring to medicine, to stand beside you in the store and in life, and to build something extraordinary together in this unlikely place." When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer from the congregation was loud enough to be heard at the mine. Margaret kissed her husband, and felt complete in a way she hadn't since leaving Boston. The wedding dinner was held in the church hall, a potluck affair with contributions from across the community. The Chinese families brought exotic dishes that most of the town had never tasted. The Irish miners contributed whiskey that probably wasn't entirely legal, and the respectable families brought traditional American fare. It was during the toast that the true impact of Margaret's presence became clear. One after another, people stood to speak not just of the bride and groom, but of what Margaret had already meant to the community. "She saved my wife and daughter," Mr. Patterson said, raising his glass. "But more than that, she showed my daughter that she can be anything she wants to be." "She gave us hope," Mr. Chen added in careful English. "When we thought we lose everything, she gave us 2 sons." Even crusty Big Tom McKenna stood up. "I'll admit, I wasn't sure about a lady doctor at first, but she set my arm better than Doc Morrison ever did. No offense, Doc. And she didn't lecture me about my drinking while she did it." The laughter was warm and inclusive, and Margaret felt the last of her Boston wounds beginning to heal. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was becoming something better, more real, more honest. That night, as she and James finally retired to their room together, she felt nervous in a way that had nothing to do with medicine. She knew the anatomy, the mechanics, but this was different. This was intimacy with someone who knew all her secrets and loved her anyway. James was gentle and patient, understanding that despite her medical knowledge, she was inexperienced in the physical aspects of love. "We have time," he whispered against her neck, "all the time in the world." But time, as Margaret was learning, was the one thing a frontier doctor never had in abundance. They'd barely finished breakfast the next morning when Doc Morrison appeared, looking graver than she'd ever seen him. "There's something you need to know," he said, pulling out a letter. "This came on yesterday's stage, but I didn't want to ruin your wedding. It's from the Territorial Medical Board. Someone, we can guess who, has written to them about you practicing medicine without proper territorial certification." Margaret's blood ran cold. Of course, Mrs. Hartwell wouldn't give up so easily. "What does this mean?" James asked, his arm going protectively around Margaret's waist. "It means they're sending an inspector," Doc Morrison said. "He'll be here within the month to evaluate whether Margaret can continue practicing, if he rules against her." He didn't need to finish. They all knew what it would mean. "Can they do that?" James's voice had turned hard. "She has a medical degree." "From Pennsylvania," Doc Morrison pointed out. "Not from Colorado Territory. Different places have different requirements, and they can use that against her if they choose." Margaret sank into a chair, feeling the weight of déjà vu. Was she destined to always be fighting for the right to use her skills? Would there always be someone trying to tear down what she'd built? "We'll fight it," James said firmly. "We'll get testimonials from everyone you've saved. The whole town will support you." "Not the whole town," Margaret said quietly. "And the inspector will likely be a man who shares Mrs. Hartwell's views about women in medicine." "Then we make it impossible for him to rule against you," Doc Morrison said with surprising fire. "We document everything, every life saved, every successful procedure. We make the case so overwhelming that he'd look like a fool to deny you." Over the next 2 weeks, they did exactly that. Margaret threw herself into her work with renewed determination, carefully documenting every case. The universe seemed to conspire to give her opportunities to prove herself. A difficult breech birth that she handled flawlessly, a case of appendicitis that she diagnosed and Doc Morrison operated on with her assistants, an outbreak of whooping cough that she contained before it could spread through the school. But it was the mine explosion that really changed everything. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the ground shaking with the force of it. The dynamite storage had somehow ignited, causing a massive collapse in the main tunnel. This time, the casualties were severe. 12 men trapped, several certainly dead, others injured beyond what the town had ever dealt with. Margaret and Doc Morrison worked side by side for 16 straight hours. She performed her first solo amputation to save a man whose leg had been crushed beyond repair. She did emergency surgery to remove shrapnel from another man's abdomen. She even managed to save a man everyone else had given up for dead, performing a tracheotomy when his throat swelled shut from smoke inhalation. By the time the sun rose, 7 men who should have died were alive because of her efforts, but the cost was visible. She was swaying on her feet, her dress ruined with blood, her hands shaking from exhaustion. "You need to rest," James urged, but she shook her head. "The inspector could arrive any day. I need to document everything while it's fresh." It was Mrs. Chen who provided an unexpected solution. The quiet woman appeared at the office with several other Chinese women carrying soup and tea. "You save us, we save you," she said simply. "We write letters." Many letters. "Tell everyone what you do for us." The Chinese community, Margaret learned, had connections throughout the territory. Merchants, railroad workers, other mining towns. Within days, letters of support began arriving from places Margaret had never heard of, all testifying to her skill and dedication. The Irish miners organized their own campaign, using their network to spread word of the lady doctor who saved 7 men in one night. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the core truth remained. Margaret was a talented physician who put saving lives above all else. Even some of Mrs. Hartwell's supporters began to waver. When Mrs. Hartwell's own niece fell ill with pneumonia and Doc Morrison was too exhausted to attend her, it was Margaret who spent 3 nights nursing the girl back to health. The girl's mother, Mrs. Hartwell's own sister, publicly thanked Margaret in church the following Sunday. "I don't care what anyone says," she declared, looking directly at her sister. "Dr. Margaret saved my Amy. That's all that matters to a mother." The inspector arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the wedding. Mr. Frederick Dennison was exactly what Margaret had expected, a stern man in his 50s with mutton chops and a disapproving expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. "I understand there's been some irregularity here," he said, looking at Margaret as if she were a specimen to be studied rather than a person. "The only irregularity," Doc Morrison said firmly, "is that we have a qualified physician actually saving lives instead of just going through the motions." Dennison's expression soured further. "I'll be the judge of that. I'll need to review all medical records, observe procedures, and interview townspeople. This investigation will be thorough." Margaret's heart sank. She recognized the type, a man who'd already made up his mind before arriving, but she underestimated the town's response. The next morning, Dennison found his boarding house surrounded by miners, all claiming various ailments that required immediate attention from Dr. Margaret. When he tried to interview Mrs. Hartwell, he found the Patterson baby crawling in the woman's parlor while Mrs. Patterson extolled Margaret's virtues. Even the saloon girls, who rarely ventured to the respectable part of town, showed up to testify about how Margaret had treated them with dignity when they needed medical care. "This is highly irregular," Dennison complained to Doc Morrison. "So is having a talented physician dismissed because of her gender?" the old doctor replied. The breaking point came when Dennison witnessed Margaret in action. A young boy fell from a tree, suffering a compound fracture and severe bleeding. Margaret responded immediately, cleaning the wound with carbolic acid, setting the bone with precision, and suturing the damage with tiny, neat stitches that would minimize scarring. "Where did you learn that technique?" Dennison asked, despite himself. "From Dr. Joseph Lister's papers on antiseptic surgery," Margaret replied calmly, "though I've modified it based on my own experience with infection prevention." She went on to explain her theories, backing them up with statistics from her carefully kept records. Despite his prejudices, Dennison was a doctor, and he couldn't deny the science behind her methods. That evening, he attended a town meeting that had been called specifically for his benefit. One by one, townspeople stood to speak, not just those Margaret had saved, but others who had seen the difference she'd made. "Before Dr. Margaret came, we lost 3 women in childbirth last year," the midwife, Mrs. Brennan, said. She'd sobered up since Margaret's arrival, shamed by the younger woman's competence. "Since she's been here, we haven't lost a single one." "The mine casualties are down by half," the mine foreman reported. "She taught us about wound cleaning and proper bandaging, things that seemed simple but make all the difference. Even Reverend Matthews spoke up. I've seen her treat everyone equally, rich and poor, white and Chinese, respectable women and fallen ones. She embodies Christian charity in her actions, regardless of what some might say about her profession." The most powerful testimony came from Lucy Morrison. The young girl stood up, clutching a notebook. "Mr. Dennison," she said clearly, "I want to be a doctor someday. Dr. Margaret has been teaching me, and I've been keeping notes." She opened her notebook, showing pages of careful observations and drawings. "She's taught me more about science and medicine in 2 months than I learned in years of regular school. If you send her away, you're not just taking away our doctor. You're taking away my future and the futures of other girls like me who might want to be more than what people expect." Dennison looked uncomfortable. Margaret could see him struggling between his preconceptions and the evidence before him. The final verdict came the next morning. Dennison called Margaret, Dr. Morrison, and James to the medical office. "I came here expecting to find an unqualified woman playing at being a doctor," he said stiffly. "Instead, I find a highly competent physician whose methods are more advanced than many male doctors I've evaluated." He paused, clearly finding the words difficult. "I will be recommending that the Territorial Medical Board grant you full certification to practice medicine in Colorado Territory." Margaret sagged with relief, and James's arm came around her immediately. "However," Dennison continued, "I strongly suggest you publish your work on antiseptic procedures and infection prevention. It could save lives throughout the territory." Margaret's eyes widened. Publish under her own name? After what had happened in Boston? "I'll ensure it's properly attributed," Dennison said, understanding her hesitation. "I may have my prejudices, but I'm not a thief. Good medicine is good medicine, regardless of who practices it." After he left, Margaret stood in the office that was now officially hers, looking at the certificate Dennison had signed. Dr. Margaret Rowland, licensed physician, Colorado Territory. "You did it," James said, pulling her close. "You're officially, undeniably, a doctor." "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, without the town's support." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. Speaking of which, there's something else. I'm retiring. Officially. My hands aren't steady enough anymore, and my eyes, well, we all know the truth. I'll stay on as advisor if you want, but this practice is yours now, Margaret. It was overwhelming. In 2 months, she'd gone from a runaway bride hiding her past to the official town doctor with her own practice. That evening, there was another celebration, this one at the saloon, a place respectable women didn't usually go, but Margaret had learned that respectability was relative on the frontier. Mrs. Hartwell was notably absent, but her sister was there, raising a glass to the doctor who saved my daughter. "You've won," James said as they danced to the fiddle music. "For now," Margaret said realistically. "There will always be those who think women shouldn't be doctors." "Then we'll keep fighting them," James said simply. Together. As she looked around the room, at the miners and their wives, the Chinese families, the saloon girls, the respectable merchants, all mingling in a way that would have been impossible in Boston, Margaret realized she'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just acceptance, but community. The story could have ended there, with Margaret established and accepted, but life, as any doctor knows, doesn't follow neat narratives. 6 months into her official practice, a letter arrived that made Margaret's blood run cold. It was from Boston, from a lawyer representing William Ashford. He was suing her for theft of intellectual property, claiming she was using his antiseptic techniques without permission. "He can't do this," James said, furious. "Those were your techniques. Your research." "He can, and he is," Margaret said quietly. "He has the published papers in his name. I have nothing but my word." "Then we fight," Doc Morrison said. He'd been reading in the corner, but now he stood with surprising energy for his age. "Margaret, do you still have your original research notes, the ones from before you knew him?" "Yes, but, and I assume they're dated?" "In your handwriting?" "Handwriting?" "Yes, but his lawyers will claim I forged them." "Not if we can prove otherwise." Doc Morrison pulled out a box of letters. "I've been corresponding with colleagues back east for years," including Dr. Tarn. Elizabeth Blackwell, who mentioned a brilliant young student of hers working on antiseptic procedures. The letters are dated 2 years before Ashford's publication. Margaret stared at him. "You knew? All this time?" "I suspected. I may be old, but I still read medical journals. Ashford's work seemed familiar, and then when I saw your techniques..." He shrugged. "I've been gathering evidence, just in case." The legal battle that followed was conducted mostly through letters and testimonials. Margaret's supporters in Timber Creek raised money for her legal defense, even Mrs. Hartwell contributing quietly through her sister. The Chinese community used their networks to find witnesses from Boston's Chinatown who remembered Margaret treating them with her experimental techniques before Ashford's publication. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. A nurse from the Boston hospital, someone Margaret barely remembered, wrote to say she had kept detailed notes of Margaret's procedures, dated and witnessed, because she'd found them so effective. She'd been afraid to come forward before, but hearing about Margaret's success in Colorado gave her courage. The case never went to trial. Faced with mounting evidence and the threat of public exposure, Ashford withdrew his claim. More importantly, he was forced to publish a retraction acknowledging Margaret's pioneering work in antiseptic surgery. The day that news arrived, Margaret was delivering another baby, her 50th successful delivery since arriving in Timber Creek. As she handed the healthy infant to its mother, she thought about how far she'd come from that frightened woman stepping off the stagecoach. "Dr. Margaret," the new mother said, "thank you for everything." "Just doing my job," Margaret replied, but she was smiling. That evening, she and James sat on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Her hands were stained with iodine, his with ink from the store's ledgers. They were an unlikely pair, the shopkeeper and the doctor, but they fit together perfectly. "Any regrets?" James asked, taking her hand. "About what?" "This life. It's not what you trained for, not the prestigious Boston practice you must have dreamed of." Margaret thought about it. In Boston, she'd been fighting for the right to exist in her profession. Here, she was simply living it. She'd delivered babies, set bones, performed surgeries, treated epidemics. She'd taught Lucy Morrison and 2 other girls who showed interest in medicine. She'd published 3 papers in territorial medical journals, all under her own name. "No regrets," she said finally. "This is better than what I dreamed of. It's real." James squeezed her hand. "Good, because I have news. Remember that family from Kentucky that was thinking of settling here? They're coming, and they're bringing a doctor with them. A young man fresh from medical school." Margaret tensed. "Competition?" "Partnership," James corrected. "He wrote asking if you'd consider taking him on as an assistant. Apparently your reputation has spread. He wants to learn from, and I quote, the famous Dr. Margaret Rowland who's revolutionizing frontier medicine." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the valley. "Famous? If only William Ashford could see me now." "He'd be jealous," James said confidently. "You're doing what he never could, making a real difference in people's lives." As if to underscore his point, young Lucy Morrison came running up the path. "Dr. Margaret! Mrs. Kim is in labor, and it's twins again." Margaret sighed and stood, reaching for her medical bag. "Duty calls." "I'll come with you," James said, standing as well. "Someone needs to keep track of all these babies you're delivering. Future customers for the store." As they walked toward the Kim house, Margaret reflected on the strange turns life could take. She'd come to Timber Creek as a mail-order bride, hiding her past as a doctor. Now she was the town's respected physician, married to a man who celebrated rather than feared her abilities. The frontier had given her what civilization couldn't, the freedom to be exactly who she was. The Kim twins arrived safely just after midnight, 2 healthy boys who announced their presence with lusty cries that could be heard 3 houses away. Margaret emerged from the delivery exhausted but satisfied, her dress blood-stained and her hair escaping from its careful pins. James waited outside with Mr. Kim, both men pacing the narrow porch until she appeared. 2 more future customers, she told her husband with a tired smile. Better stock up on baby supplies. But her satisfaction was short-lived. The next morning brought disturbing news from the mining camps higher in the mountains. Several men had fallen ill with symptoms that made Margaret's blood run cold: high fever, delirium, and a distinctive rash that spread from the trunk outward. "Typhoid," she told Doc Morrison grimly after examining the first patient brought down from the camp. "We're looking at an epidemic if we don't act fast." The old doctor's face paled. He'd seen typhoid epidemics before, watched entire towns decimated by the disease. "What do you need?" "Isolation ward immediately. We need to quarantine anyone showing symptoms and trace the source. It's waterborne. Something's contaminated their water supply." Margaret was already making lists in her head, calculating supplies and organizing treatment protocols. "James, we'll need every clean sheet and blanket in your store. And send someone to Denver for medical supplies. We're going to need more quinine and laudanum than we have." The next weeks tested Margaret in ways that her previous challenges hadn't. Typhoid was a killer, and even with her modern understanding of disease transmission, she was fighting an uphill battle. The mining camp's water source had been contaminated by runoff from latrines, a common problem she'd tried to address months ago, only to be dismissed by the mine owners as a hysterical woman overstepping her bounds. Now those same owners begged for her help as their workers fell ill by the dozens. Margaret set up the isolation ward in the old barn behind the church, transforming it into a makeshift hospital. She trained volunteers in basic nursing care, established strict hygiene protocols that seemed excessive to many, but which she enforced with iron determination. "Wash your hands between each patient," she instructed her volunteers for the 100th time. "I don't care if they look clean. The disease spreads through contamination we can't see." Mrs. Hartwell, of all people, became one of her most dedicated volunteers. The older woman had appeared on the second day of the crisis, wearing a plain dress instead of her usual finery. "I may not approve of lady doctors," she said stiffly, "but I'm not going to stand by while people suffer. Tell me what to do." It was a truce of sorts, born of necessity but genuine in its execution. Margaret showed her how to cool fevered patients with wet cloths, how to force fluids into delirious men who fought against treatment, how to recognize the signs of the crisis that would determine whether a patient lived or died. The young doctor from Kentucky, Dr. Thomas Brennan, arrived in the middle of the epidemic. Fresh-faced and eager, he'd expected to find a frontier practice where he could learn at a measured pace. Instead, he was thrown into medical combat. Dr. Aj, Rowland, he said after his first exhausting shift, I learned more in the last 12 hours than in my entire final year of medical school. Crisis teaching, Margaret replied wearily. Not ideal, but effective. Together, they fought the epidemic patient by patient. Margaret's antiseptic procedures proved their worth, while other frontier towns reporting typhoid outbreaks saw mortality rates near 40%. Timber Creek lost only 12 souls out of 60 infected. But those 12 deaths weighed on Margaret. She knew each face, each story. The young miner who'd been sending money home to his widowed mother in Ireland. The Chinese laborer whose wife had just discovered she was pregnant. The 14-year-old boy who'd lied about his age to get work in the mines. It was while preparing this boy for burial that Margaret finally broke. She'd maintained her professional composure throughout the crisis, but seeing his young face, peaceful in death, reminded her of all the limitations even the best doctor faced. James found her crying in their bedroom, her strong facade finally crumbling. I couldn't save them all, she sobbed against his shoulder. I tried everything, but 12 people still died. 48 lived, James reminded her gently. 48 people who would have died without you. Even Doc Morrison says he's never seen such a low mortality rate for typhoid. But that boy, Timothy, he was so young. And he would have died whether you were here or not. But the others, they lived because of you. Focus on that. The epidemic finally broke after 6 weeks. The mine owners, chastened by the near destruction of their workforce, finally agreed to Margaret's sanitation recommendations. New latrines were dug far from water sources, and she instituted regular health inspections that the owners grumbled about but didn't dare refuse. Dr. Brennan proved to be a valuable addition to the practice. Unlike many male doctors who would have resented working under a woman, he genuinely respected Margaret's expertise and eagerly absorbed her teachings. Why aren't you resentful? Margaret asked him one day as they worked side by side, setting a broken leg. Most men would be. My sister wanted to be a doctor, he replied, his hands steady as he held the bone in place while she wrapped it. She was brilliant, far smarter than me. But no medical school would take her. She died in childbirth 3 years ago. Hemorrhaging that any competent doctor could have prevented, but the only available physician was drunk. He met her eyes. If she'd been allowed to pursue medicine, she might be alive today. So no, Dr. Rowland, I'm not resentful. I'm grateful to learn from someone who fought for the right to save lives. His presence allowed Margaret to expand her practice in ways she hadn't anticipated. With someone to share the routine cases, she could pursue research into altitude sickness that plagued newcomers to the mountains, develop new treatments for mining-related lung diseases, and even begin teaching a formal class for young women interested in medicine. Lucy Morrison was her star pupil, but 3 other girls joined the informal medical education Margaret provided. She taught them anatomy using diagrams she drew herself, chemistry using the limited supplies from James's store, and practical nursing skills that would serve them whether or not they ever became doctors. It was during one of these lessons that unexpected visitors arrived. Margaret was demonstrating suturing techniques on a piece of leather when James appeared in the doorway of the medical office, his expression unreadable. Margaret, there are some people here to see you, from Boston. Her blood ran cold. Behind James stood 3 figures, 2 men in expensive suits and a woman in traveling clothes that screamed Eastern sophistication. Margaret recognized one of the men immediately, Dr. Harrison Whitmore, Chief of Staff at Boston General Hospital. Dr. Hale. Excuse me, Dr. Rowland now, I understand, Whitmore said, removing his hat. May we speak privately? Margaret's students scattered at her nod, though Lucy lingered until Margaret shooed her away. James started to leave as well, but Margaret caught his hand. My husband stays, she said firmly. Whitmore nodded. Of course. This concerns him as well, I suppose. He gestured to his companions. This is Mr. Jonathan Blackwood from the Boston Medical Society and Mrs. Catherine Ashford. Margaret stiffened at the last name. Ashford? William's widow, the woman said quietly. She was younger than Margaret had expected, with tired eyes and a mourning dress that looked several months old. He died 6 months ago. A riding accident. Margaret felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sorrow, just emptiness where William Ashford was concerned. I'm sorry for your loss, she said formally. Don't be, Catherine Ashford replied with surprising bitterness. I discovered after his death what kind of man he really was, including what he did to you. Whitmore cleared his throat. We've come to make amends, Dr. Rowland. The medical community in Boston has reviewed the evidence regarding the antiseptic procedures, and it's clear that you were the true innovator. Ashford stole your work and destroyed your career to cover his theft. That's been established already, Margaret said coolly. He was forced to publish a retraction. A retraction isn't enough, Blackwood spoke for the first time. The Boston Medical Society wants to formally restore your reputation and offer you a position at Boston General. Full surgical privileges, your own research laboratory, and a teaching position at the medical college. Everything she'd once dreamed of, offered on a silver platter. Margaret felt James's hand tighten on hers, but he said nothing, leaving the decision to her. Why now? She asked. It's been over 2 years since I left Boston. Catherine Ashford spoke up. Because I found his journals. He documented everything, his theft of your research, his plan to discredit you, even bribes he paid to certain board members to ensure your dismissal. She pulled a leather journal from her bag, offering it to Margaret. It's all here. I've already provided copies to the authorities. Several members of the medical board are facing criminal charges. Margaret took the journal with trembling hands. Here was complete vindication, proof of everything she'd claimed. She could return to Boston triumphant, reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. We need you, Dr. Rowland, Whitmore pressed. Your techniques have revolutionized surgical practice. Imagine what you could accomplish with proper resources and support. I have proper resources and support, Margaret said, surprising herself with the firmness of her response. I have a practice here, patients who depend on me, students I'm training. Surely you're not comparing this frontier outpost to Boston General, Blackwood said with barely concealed disdain. No, I'm not comparing them, Margaret agreed. There's no comparison. In Boston, I had to fight for every patient, justify my presence every day, prove myself over and over to men who resented my existence in their profession. Here, I'm simply a doctor. I've delivered over 100 babies, performed dozens of surgeries, stopped a typhoid epidemic, and trained the next generation of medical practitioners, including young women who would never have a chance in Boston. Things have changed, Whitmore insisted. With Ashford's crimes exposed, the climate is different now. For how long? Margaret challenged. Until the next William Ashford decides that a woman is too much competition, until the board finds new reasons to restrict female physicians. Catherine Ashford had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke. She's right, gentlemen. You're offering her the chance to return to a cage, even if it's a gilded one. Look at what she's built here. She gestured around the medical office with its neat shelves of supplies, the examination table Margaret had designed herself, the charts on the walls documenting successful treatments. This is freedom. You could have both. Whitmore tried one last time. Split your time between Boston and Colorado. Margaret looked at James, who had remained silent throughout the conversation. His face was carefully neutral, but she knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. What do you think? She asked him. I think, he said carefully, that you should do what makes you happy. If that means Boston, it doesn't, Margaret interrupted. Boston was my past. This is my future. She turned back to the visitors. Thank you for coming all this way, and thank you, Mrs. Ashford, for the journal. It means more than you know to have proof of the truth. But my place is here. Whitmore looked disappointed, but not entirely surprised. If you change your mind, I won't. After they left, Margaret and James stood in silence for a moment. Then James pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. Were you really ready to let me go to Boston? She asked against his chest. If it would have made you happy, yes. But I would have followed you. And left your store? The store is just a building. You're my life, Margaret. She pulled back to look at him. This is my life. Our life. Timber Creek, the practice, all of it. I meant what I said. I have more freedom here than I ever would in Boston. That evening, the town threw an impromptu celebration when word spread that Margaret had turned down Boston to stay in Timber Creek. Even Mrs. Hartwell, who had become something of an ally during the typhoid epidemic, raised a glass to our doctor. But life in a frontier town never stayed calm for long. 3 months after the Boston delegation's visit, a new crisis emerged. The railroad was coming through, bringing with it an influx of workers, prosperity, and problems. The population of Timber Creek doubled almost overnight as construction crews set up camp on the outskirts of town. With them came diseases Margaret had rarely seen in such concentration: syphilis, gonorrhea, and other ailments that proper society preferred to pretend didn't exist. The railroad workers frequented the saloons and brothels, and soon Margaret was treating not just injuries from construction accidents, but the consequences of frontier vice. It created a new tension in the town. The respectable women, led by a reinvigorated Mrs. Hartwell, wanted the brothels closed and the soiled doves run out of town. The business owners, including James to Margaret's surprise, argued that the workers would simply go elsewhere to spend their money, taking prosperity with them. Margaret found herself in the middle, treating everyone regardless of their moral standing, which earned her criticism from both sides. "You're enabling their sin," Mrs. Hartwell accused during a particularly heated town meeting. "I'm preventing the spread of disease," Margaret countered. "These women are going to practice their trade whether I treat them or not. Would you rather have syphilis spreading through the entire town? It wouldn't spread if proper women— It spreads because men who visit prostitutes also have wives," Margaret said bluntly, causing several women in the audience to gasp. "I've treated 3 married women for syphilis in the last month, infected by their husbands who thought what happened at the brothel stayed at the brothel." The revelation caused an uproar, but it also shifted the conversation. Margaret proposed a radical solution: regular medical inspections for the prostitutes, treatment for those who were ill, and education about disease prevention. "You're asking us to legitimize prostitution," Reverend Matthews said, clearly troubled. "I'm asking you to choose between moral purity and public health," Margaret replied. "Because right now, we can't have both." It was Dr. Brennan who provided unexpected support. In New Orleans, they've implemented similar programs. The infection rates dropped by 60%. The town council voted narrowly to allow Margaret's program, though the controversy continued to simmer. She began weekly clinics at the brothel, treating the women with the same professionalism she showed all her patients. It was there she met Sarah, a young woman barely 18 who had fled an abusive marriage and found herself with few options for survival. "I don't want this life," Sarah confided during an examination, "but I don't know how to do anything else." Margaret thought of her own journey, the twist that had brought her to Timber Creek. "Can you read and write?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me before she died. I need an assistant for my clinics, someone to help with record keeping and basic nursing tasks. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You'd hire me, knowing what I've been?" "I'd hire someone who wants to change her life," Margaret said firmly. The decision to hire Sarah caused another controversy, but Margaret stood firm. Within months, Sarah proved herself invaluable, her gentle manner particularly effective with frightened patients. She also became another student in Margaret's informal medical classes, showing a natural aptitude for diagnosis. The railroad's arrival brought other changes. A newspaper reporter from Denver came to write about the lady doctor of Timber Creek, a story that spread Margaret's reputation even further. Letters began arriving from other frontier towns, asking for advice on medical matters, and from young women seeking guidance on pursuing medical careers. One letter stood out, from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, her alma mater. "Dear Dr. Rowland," it read, "your work in Colorado has come to our attention. We are establishing a program to place female physicians in frontier communities where they can practice with greater freedom than in eastern cities. Would you consider serving as a mentor and regional coordinator for this program?" It was an opportunity to expand her impact beyond Timber Creek to help other women find the freedom she'd discovered. Margaret accepted immediately. The first graduate arrived 6 months later. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a Chinese-American woman who had faced double discrimination in San Francisco. Margaret took her under her wing, helping her establish a practice in the growing Chinese section of town where language and cultural barriers had previously prevented proper medical care. "How do you do it?" Elizabeth asked after a particularly difficult day when several white patients had refused her treatment. How do you keep going when people reject you for who you are? You focus on the ones you can help, Margaret advised. And you remember that every life you save, every patient you heal, proves them wrong. Eventually, results speak louder than prejudice. It was advice Margaret had to follow herself when a diphtheria outbreak struck the town's children. The disease was swift and merciless, attacking the throat and airways, suffocating its young victims. Margaret had read about a new treatment being developed in Europe, an antitoxin derived from horses. But it wasn't available in America yet. "We're going to lose them all," Dr. Brennan said desperately as another child was brought in, gasping for air. "No," Margaret said with determination that surprised even her. "We're going to try something radical." She'd been corresponding with a doctor in Germany who had shared the basic principles of creating the antitoxin. It was risky, experimental, but doing nothing meant certain death for dozens of children. Margaret set up a makeshift laboratory in the barn, using one of the horses from the livery stable. The process was complex and dangerous, injecting the horse with small amounts of diphtheria toxin to stimulate antibody production, then extracting and purifying the serum. "This is insane," Mrs. Hartwell said when she learned what Margaret was doing. But her granddaughter was among the sick, and desperation won over skepticism. But if it might save her, the first batch of antitoxin was ready after 5 agonizing days. Margaret tested it on the sickest children first, those who had hours at most to live. Within 12 hours, their breathing eased. Within 24, they were sitting up and taking broth. "It's a miracle," Reverend Matthews proclaimed from the pulpit. "It's science," Margaret corrected, but she was smiling through her exhaustion. The diphtheria antitoxin saved 37 children who would have died otherwise. Word of Margaret's innovation spread throughout the medical community, and soon she was receiving correspondence from doctors across the country wanting to learn her methods. But success brought new challenges. A group of investors from Denver arrived, proposing to build a hospital in Timber Creek with Margaret as chief of staff. It was everything she could have wanted, a real hospital with proper operating theaters, laboratory facilities, and beds for 50 patients. "Think of what you could accomplish," the lead investor, Mr. Harold Morrison, no relation to Doc Morrison, urged. "You'd be the first female chief of staff at a hospital west of the Mississippi." The offer was tempting, but Margaret had learned to look deeper than surface opportunities. Who would control the hospital policies? Well, the board of directors, of course, prominent businessmen who understand profit, Margaret interrupted. Would this board include any women? Any members of the Chinese community? Any representation from the miners who would make up most of the patients? Morrison looked uncomfortable. "That's not how hospital boards work, Dr. Rowland." "Then I'm not interested." But the seed had been planted. Timber Creek did need a hospital, just not one controlled by distant investors. Margaret began planning with James, Doc Morrison, and surprisingly, Mrs. Hartwell, who had become one of her strongest supporters. "We'll build it ourselves," Margaret declared. "A community hospital, owned and operated by the town." It took 2 years of fundraising, planning, and construction, but the Timber Creek Community Hospital opened in the spring of 1882. It was modest, 20 beds, 1 operating theater, and a small laboratory, but it was theirs. The board included representatives from every part of the community, including, at Margaret's insistence, 2 women and 1 member of the Chinese community. Doc Morrison, now in his mid-70s and officially retired, cut the ribbon. "This hospital represents something more than medical care," he said in his speech. "It represents what's possible when we put aside our prejudices and work together." Margaret stood beside James, watching as the townspeople toured their new hospital. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the promising student in Pennsylvania to the disgraced physician fleeing Boston, from the mail-order bride hiding her identity to the respected doctor and chief of staff. "Any regrets now?" James asked quietly. Margaret looked at the crowd. Lucy Morrison, now 17 and preparing to apply to medical school with Margaret's recommendation. Sarah, who had become a skilled nurse and was engaged to a railroad engineer who didn't care about her past. Dr. Chen, who had delivered her 20th baby the week before. Dr. Brennan, who had married the school teacher and started a family while maintaining his partnership in the practice. No regrets, she said. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. But that evening brought a reminder that not all battles were won. A telegram arrived from Boston. Catherine Ashford had died suddenly, and her will named Margaret as the beneficiary of William's medical library and research notes, along with a substantial sum of money. She's giving me everything he stole, Margaret said wonderingly, reading the legal documents that accompanied the telegram. His entire collection, all his research, most of which was mine anyway, and enough money to fund the hospital for years. Will you go to Boston for the funeral? James asked. Margaret considered it. Catherine Ashford had shown courage in exposing her husband's crimes, and she deserved respect for that. Yes, but not alone. I want you to come with me. To Boston? To show them what I've built, Margaret said with a smile that held a hint of triumph. To show them that their loss was Timber Creek's gain. The trip to Boston was surreal. The city seemed smaller than Margaret remembered, more confined. The medical society held a reception in her honor, and she found herself surrounded by men who had once dismissed her, now eager to hear about her frontier innovations. Your work with diphtheria antitoxin is groundbreaking, one professor gushed. You must publish immediately. I have, Margaret replied coolly. In the Colorado Medical Journal, the Frontier Physician Quarterly, and the Women's Medical Review. Perhaps you should expand your reading. She attended Catherine's funeral, a quiet affair with few mourners. Afterward, she visited William's grave, feeling nothing but a distant sadness for the waste of what could have been. Not their relationship, but his potential to do good instead of harm. The medical library was impressive, and Margaret arranged for it to be shipped to Timber Creek. But it was in William's private papers that she found the most valuable treasure. Correspondence with European physicians about experimental treatments, research that he'd hidden away because it didn't serve his immediate ambitions. He was so focused on glory that he missed the real opportunities to advance medicine, she told James, as they sorted through the papers in William's former study. His blindness was Timber Creek's gain, James replied. These resources will help hundreds of people. They returned to Colorado with 2 additional travelers, a young woman named Patricia, who had sought out Margaret at the Boston reception, desperate to escape an arranged marriage and pursue medicine, and surprisingly, Dr. Whitmore's daughter Rebecca, who had defied her father to seek training under Margaret. He'll disinherit me, Rebecca said cheerfully as the train carried them west. But what use is inheritance if you can't live your own life? Margaret saw herself in these young women, the determination, the willingness to sacrifice respectability for purpose. She would train them as she'd been trained, but without the obstacles, without the need to hide or diminish themselves. The hospital thrived under Margaret's leadership. Within a year, they'd added a maternity ward and a children's wing, funded by Catherine Ashford's bequest. The mortality rate in Timber Creek dropped to the lowest in the territory, and other towns began sending their difficult cases to Margaret's team. But it was a personal milestone that marked Margaret's greatest triumph. On a cold December morning in 1883, she discovered she was pregnant. At 37, she had assumed motherhood had passed her by, but her own body proved her wrong. A baby, James said wonderingly when she told him. Our baby. I'm old for a first pregnancy, Margaret warned. There are risks, which you're uniquely qualified to manage, James interrupted. Margaret, this is wonderful. The pregnancy was difficult, as she'd expected. Her age, combined with the demands of her practice, took their toll. Dr. Brennan and Dr. Chen took over most of her duties, while Margaret found herself in the unusual position of being a patient. This is intolerable, she complained to James after being confined to bed rest in her 8th month. I have work to do. You have a baby to grow, he countered. Let others take care of the town for once. The labor was long and complicated, and for the first time Margaret understood the fear her patients felt. But with Dr. Chen attending and Sarah assisting, she delivered a healthy daughter just as the sun rose on a spring morning in 1884. What will you name her? Lucy Morrison asked, now back from her first year at medical school, visiting her mentor and new baby. Margaret looked at the infant in her arms, then at James, who was gazing at both of them with such love it took her breath away. Hope, she said. Hope Catherine Rowland, because she represents everything I thought I'd lost and found again. The first weeks with baby Hope transformed Margaret's understanding of her patients in ways medical school never could. She found herself examining her daughter with the dual vision of doctor and mother, marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped hers with surprising strength, while simultaneously monitoring respiratory rates and reflexes. James often found her in the nursery at odd hours, making notes in a journal she'd started about infant development. "You're studying our daughter like she's a research subject," he said one night, though his tone was amused rather than critical. "I'm observing," Margaret corrected, adjusting Hope's blanket. "Do you know how little we actually understand about infant development? Most of what we consider medical knowledge about babies comes from old wives' tales rather than scientific observation." It was this realization that led to Margaret's next innovation. She established what she called well-baby clinics at the hospital, free sessions where mothers could bring healthy infants for regular checkups rather than waiting until illness struck. The concept was revolutionary, preventive care rather than reactive treatment. Mrs. Hartwell, who had become one of Margaret's most unlikely champions, organized the town's women to support the initiative. "If Dr. Rowland says it will keep our children healthier, then by God, we'll make sure every mother in this town participates." The clinics revealed problems Margaret hadn't anticipated. Many mothers, especially among the poorer families, were malnourished themselves, affecting their ability to nurse. Children showed signs of rickets from lack of proper nutrition. Some families were using dangerous home remedies that did more harm than good. "We need to do more than treat illness," Margaret told the hospital board. "We need to address the conditions that cause illness." This led to the establishment of what Margaret called the Timber Creek Health Initiative, a comprehensive program that included nutrition education, sanitation improvements, and even a community garden where families could grow fresh vegetables. It was ambitious beyond anything a frontier town had attempted, but Margaret had learned that Timber Creek was capable of surprising things when its people united behind a cause. The program was barely underway when a new crisis struck. It started with a single patient, a railroad worker named Michael Sullivan, who came in with what appeared to be a simple fever. But Margaret noticed something unusual about his symptoms: the characteristic swelling of lymph nodes, the particular pattern of the fever, the rose-colored spots on his torso. "Bubonic plague," she whispered to Dr. Brennan, her voice barely audible even in the privacy of her office. His face went white. "That's impossible. There hasn't been plague in America. There has been in San Francisco's Chinatown. The authorities have been suppressing news of it to prevent panic." Margaret had been corresponding with Dr. Chen's colleagues in California, receiving reports that the official channels ignored. "If it's here, we have maybe days before it spreads through the entire town." The next hours were crucial. Margaret instituted an immediate quarantine of Sullivan and anyone who'd had contact with him. She sent urgent telegrams to Denver for supplies and implemented protocols that seemed extreme to many townspeople: mandatory reporting of all fever cases, isolation of suspected patients, and most controversially, a rat extermination campaign. "Rats?" Mayor Thompson asked incredulously. "You're telling us the plague is spread by rats?" "By the fleas they carry, specifically," Margaret explained, aware of how insane it sounded to those unfamiliar with the latest bacteriological research. "I know it seems far-fetched, but I've been corresponding with researchers in Hong Kong and India where plague outbreaks are more common. The connection to rats and fleas is well established." The town divided again, some trusting Margaret's expertise, others convinced she'd finally overreached. But when 2 more cases appeared, both in buildings with severe rat infestations, even skeptics began to listen. The rat campaign became a town-wide effort. James organized the merchants to offer bounties for dead rats, a nickel each, a fortune for the town's children who threw themselves into the hunt with enthusiasm. The Chinese community, familiar with plague from their homeland, shared traditional methods of rat-proofing that proved remarkably effective. Sarah, now Margaret's chief nurse, led teams through the poorer sections of town, helping families clean and seal their homes against rodents. She worked with a dedication that impressed everyone, especially considering she was now 6 months pregnant with her first child. "You should be resting," Margaret told her, though she knew the advice was hypocritical. She'd worked until the day Hope was born. "These people took me in when I had nothing," Sarah replied. "I won't abandon them now." The plague crisis lasted 3 weeks. In the end, only 7 cases emerged, and remarkably, only 1 death. Sullivan himself, who had been too far gone when he first sought treatment. It was an astounding success considering plague typically killed 60% of its victims. But the victory came at a cost. The quarantine and rat campaign had been expensive, draining the hospital's reserves. Several businesses had suffered from the isolation measures, and Margaret herself was exhausted, having barely slept during the crisis while also caring for baby Hope. It was Dr. Chen who noticed Margaret's own symptoms first, the persistent cough she'd dismissed as exhaustion, the night sweats she attributed to anxiety, the weight loss she hadn't paid attention to amid the chaos. "Margaret," she said quietly after cornering her colleague in the supply room, "when did the coughing start?" "It's nothing. Just the stress." "When did it start?" Chen's tone brooked no argument. 6 weeks ago, maybe 7. Chen's expression was grave. "You need to be examined, properly examined." The diagnosis was what Margaret had feared but refused to acknowledge: tuberculosis. The disease that claimed so many lives on the frontier, that filled sanitariums with desperate souls seeking clean mountain air. She'd been exposed countless times over the years, and now, weakened by pregnancy and exhaustion, her body had finally succumbed. "The irony is not lost on me," she told James that evening as they sat in their parlor, Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, unaware of how her world had just shifted. "I saved the town from plague only to discover I have consumption." James pulled her close, and she could feel him trembling. "There are treatments. Sanitariums, you know what needs to be done." "I need to go away," Margaret said, voicing what they both knew. "The high-altitude sanitarium in Colorado Springs. Dr. Brennan and Dr. Chen can manage the practice, but I need to go away, possibly for months. Then we all go. Hope and I will come with you. James, the store can be managed by others. You're my wife, Margaret. Where you go, I go." But it wasn't that simple. Hope was still nursing, and the sanitarium wouldn't accept infants for fear of infection. The store was James's livelihood and couldn't be abandoned for months. And the hospital needed steady leadership, not the chaos that would come from Margaret's sudden absence. In the end, they compromised. Margaret would go to the sanitarium for initial treatment, 3 months minimum. James would stay in Timber Creek with Hope, bringing her to visit when the doctors deemed it safe. Sarah, despite her pregnancy, would help care for Hope, along with a wet nurse they hired from among the mining families. The morning of Margaret's departure was gray and cold, fitting her mood. Half the town turned out to see her off, many with tears in their eyes. She'd delivered their babies, set their bones, saved their lives, and now they faced the possibility that their doctor might not return. "You'll beat this," Lucy Morrison said fiercely. She was home from medical school for the summer, having distinguished herself in her 2nd year. "You're the strongest person I know." "Take care of them," Margaret told Dr. Brennan and Dr. Chen. "The town, I mean. They're stubborn and superstitious and wonderful. Don't let them backslide on the sanitation measures." "We won't let you down," Brennan promised. The hardest goodbye was to Hope. Margaret held her daughter, memorizing the weight of her, the sweet baby smell, the way her eyes, James's sage green eyes, tracked movement with increasing awareness. "She won't remember me," Margaret whispered to James. "Then we'll make new memories when you return," he said firmly. "Because you will return, Margaret. You have to." The sanitarium in Colorado Springs was everything Margaret had expected: clean, regimented, and filled with desperate people trying to breathe. She was assigned a private room due to her medical status, though she quickly made it clear she expected no special treatment. The treatment was harsh: complete rest, a diet of raw eggs and milk, hours lying on an open-air porch even in freezing weather, and experimental treatments involving gold salts that made her violently ill. But Margaret approached it with the same determination she'd brought to medical school, to fighting for her right to practice, to building a life in Timber Creek. She kept detailed notes of her treatment and symptoms, corresponding with researchers in Europe who were developing new approaches to tuberculosis treatment. She also found herself counseling other patients, unable to completely set aside her physician's instincts. "You're supposed to be resting," the sanitarium director, Dr. Phillips, scolded when he found her examining another patient's sputum under a microscope she'd had James send from Timber Creek. "I am resting." "I'm sitting down, aren't I?" Margaret replied, not looking up from the lens. Besides, Mrs. Cooper here has been misdiagnosed. This isn't tuberculosis, it's chronic bronchitis, probably from her husband smoking. She doesn't need to be here. Dr. Phillips examined the sample himself and was forced to agree. Besides, Cooper was discharged the next day, tearfully grateful to Margaret for giving her back her life. Letters from Timber Creek were Margaret's lifeline. James wrote daily, filling pages with stories of Hope's development, her first laugh, her attempts at rolling over, the way she grabbed at his spectacles with determined little fists. Dr. Brennan and Dr. Chen sent medical updates, consulting her on difficult cases. Even Mrs. Hartwell wrote, gossipy letters that made Margaret smile despite herself. But it was Lucy's letter that brought the most significant news. She'd been accepted to Johns Hopkins Medical School, one of the first to accept women on equal terms with men. They said your recommendation letter was what made the difference, Lucy wrote. They were impressed that I'd trained under the famous Dr. Margaret Rowland. Famous? Margaret laughed at that, a harsh sound that triggered a coughing fit. She was famous for being a woman who wouldn't give up, nothing more. The second month of treatment brought improvement. The night sweats decreased, the coughing lessened, and she began to gain weight. Dr. Phillips was cautiously optimistic. Your body is responding well to treatment. Another month, maybe 2, and you might be able to return home. But the third month brought an unexpected visitor. William Ashford's brother, Charles, arrived at the sanitarium, seeking Margaret out. I need your help, he said without preamble. My daughter, she wants to be a doctor, and every school has rejected her. They say she's too young, too delicate, too female. Sound familiar? Margaret studied him. Charles had the same sharp features as William, but his eyes held kindness rather than ambition. Why come to me? Your brother destroyed my career. Because you rebuilt it anyway. Because you proved them all wrong. And because Anna deserves better than what society wants to give her. He pulled out a photograph of a serious-looking young woman with intelligent eyes. She's brilliant, Dr. Rowland. Top of her class at Radcliffe. But that's not enough, apparently. What do you want from me? Teach her. Take her as an apprentice. Show her what you've learned about surviving as a female physician. It was audacious, asking Margaret to help the niece of the man who'd tried to destroy her. But looking at the photograph, Margaret saw herself at that age, desperate to learn, to prove herself, to heal. Send her to Timber Creek, Margaret said finally. Dr. Chen and Dr. Brennan will begin her training. When I return, I'll take over her education personally. Charles's relief was palpable. You're a remarkable woman, Dr. Rowland. My brother was a fool to make an enemy of you. Your brother was a fool for many reasons, Margaret replied. Don't let his daughter repeat his mistakes. The final month of treatment passed slowly. Margaret felt stronger each day, the disease retreating though not entirely defeated. Tuberculosis never truly left once it took hold, she knew. It would lurk in her lungs, waiting for another moment of weakness. Finally, in late autumn, Dr. Phillips declared her well enough to return home with strict conditions, limited work hours, continued rest periods, and avoiding exposure to infectious diseases when possible. You're recommending I stop being a doctor, Margaret observed. I'm recommending you be a living doctor rather than a dead one, Phillips replied bluntly. You have excellent colleagues. Learn to delegate. The journey home felt endless. Margaret pressed her face to the train window as they approached Timber Creek, drinking in the familiar sight of the mountains, the mine structures on the hillsides, the town spread out in the valley like a patchwork quilt. James was waiting at the station with Hope in his arms. Their daughter had changed dramatically in 4 months, sitting up on her own, babbling constantly, her hair grown into dark curls like Margaret's own. When Margaret reached for her, Hope studied her with solemn eyes before breaking into a gummy smile and reaching back. She remembers, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I told her about you every day, showed her your photograph. She remembers. The reunion was joyful but overwhelming. The entire town seemed to be at the station, cheering and crying. Margaret found herself passed from embrace to embrace, everyone wanting to welcome their doctor home. But it was Sarah who brought her back to reality. Her former assistant, now chief nurse, was heavily pregnant but glowing with health. We've managed, she said proudly. Followed all your protocols, didn't lose a single patient to infection. But Lord, we're glad you're back. The hospital felt different when Margaret returned to it, not physically, but in its atmosphere. Her absence had forced others to step up, to take ownership of what they'd built together. Dr. Brennan had implemented new surgical techniques he'd learned through correspondence. Dr. Chen had established a traditional Chinese medicine clinic that worked in conjunction with Western treatments. Even Mrs. Hartwell had taken charge of the fundraising committee with remarkable efficiency. "You've all outgrown me," Margaret said wonderingly after her first week back. "Never," Dr. Brennan said firmly. "We've just learned to follow your example, to innovate, to fight for what's right, to never accept that's how it's always been done as an answer." Anna Ashford arrived 2 weeks later, a thin, intense young woman who looked at Margaret with something approaching hero worship. "Aunt Catherine told me about you before she died," Anna said, "about how Uncle William wronged you. I want you to know I'm nothing like him." "Prove it," Margaret said simply. "Show me through your actions, not your words." Anna did exactly that. She threw herself into her training with a dedication that impressed even Margaret. She had her uncle's intelligence, but none of his arrogance, willing to clean bedpans and roll bandages with the same enthusiasm she brought to observing surgeries. The winter brought its usual challenges: pneumonia outbreaks, mining accidents, difficult births. But Margaret found a new rhythm, working within her limitations while still maintaining her high standards. She taught more, delegating routine cases to her colleagues while handling the complex situations that required her expertise. It was during a particularly difficult delivery that Margaret's new approach proved its worth. The patient was a young woman pregnant with twins, showing signs of preeclampsia. In the past, Margaret would have handled everything herself. Now, she directed while doctor. Chen performed the actual delivery, with Anna assisting and Sarah managing the mother's dangerous blood pressure. "Watch how Dr. Chen positions her hands," Margaret instructed Anna. "The first twin is breech, so she needs to, yes, exactly like that." The successful delivery of 2 healthy boys, despite the complications, was a team victory, and Margaret realized this was her new role. Not just practitioner, but teacher. Not just doctor, but mentor. Spring brought unexpected news. The territorial government was establishing a medical college in Denver and wanted Margaret to help design the curriculum for female students. "They're finally admitting women need different preparation," the letter from the territorial governor explained. "Not because they're less capable, but because they face unique challenges. We need someone who understands those challenges." Margaret accepted immediately, though it meant traveling to Denver monthly for planning meetings. James worried about the strain on her health, but Margaret had learned to manage her condition, resting when needed, working when able. The medical college project connected her with female physicians throughout the territory, creating a network of support that hadn't existed before. They shared techniques, discussed cases, and most importantly, recommended each other to patients who might otherwise never trust a female doctor. It was through this network that Margaret learned of a disturbing trend. Several female physicians had been attacked, not physically, but professionally, through coordinated campaigns to discredit them. The attacks all followed the same pattern: anonymous accusations of impropriety, usually involving male patients, followed by pressure on local medical boards to revoke licenses. "Someone's organizing this," Dr. Mary Peterson from Boulder wrote. "Someone with resources and connections throughout the territory." Margaret had her suspicions, especially when she received an anonymous letter warning her to remember her place or face consequences. The handwriting looked familiar, though she couldn't place it. The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Hartwell, now one of Margaret's staunchest allies, recognized the handwriting immediately. "That's Harold Morrison," she said with certainty. "The investor who wanted to build the hospital here. He's my second cousin, and I'd recognize that pretentious script anywhere." Morrison, investigation revealed, had been buying up medical practices throughout the territory, creating a monopoly on healthcare that he could control and profit from. Female physicians, with their tendency to treat poor patients for free and resist corporate control, were obstacles to his plan. "We need to fight back," Dr. Chen said during an emergency meeting of the Female Physicians Network. "But how do we fight someone with that much money and influence?" "With the truth," Margaret said, "and with each other." What followed was a coordinated campaign that would have been impossible just years earlier. Female physicians throughout the territory began documenting not just their successes, but the patterns of attacks against them. Lucy Morrison, home for summer break, used her connections at Johns Hopkins to get Eastern newspapers interested in the story. Anna Ashford convinced her father to use his influence in Boston financial circles to investigate Morrison's business practices. The breaking point came when Morrison overreached, attempting to have Margaret's license revoked based on forged documents suggesting she'd been treating patients while actively tubercular and contagious. The dates don't match, James pointed out, examining the supposed evidence with his shopkeeper's eye for detail. These claim Margaret was treating patients in Timber Creek, while she was documented as being at the sanitarium in Colorado Springs. The forgery was so obvious once exposed that Morrison's entire scheme unraveled. Several of his other attacks were revealed as similarly fabricated. The territorial governor, embarrassed by the scandal, not only reaffirmed the licenses of all affected female physicians, but established new protections against such coordinated attacks. Morrison fled the territory ahead of fraud charges, but the damage to his network was done. The female physicians had proven they could defend themselves when united, and their victory encouraged more women to pursue medical careers. "You've changed things," Anna told Margaret as they worked side by side in the hospital. "Not just for Timber Creek, but for all of us." "We've changed things," Margaret corrected. "No one person can shift society. It takes all of us pushing together." That evening, Margaret sat in her garden. Another innovation, a medicinal herb garden that provided both treatments and teaching opportunities. Hope toddled among the plants, supervised by James, who was trying to keep her from eating the leaves. Sarah's son played nearby, the two children having become inseparable. Dr. Brennan and his wife stopped by with news that their second child was on the way. Dr. Chen brought mooncakes from the Chinese New Year celebration. Anna discussed her plans to return to Boston for formal medical training, armed with Margaret's recommendation and hard-won experience. Even Mrs. Hartwell appeared, bringing gossip and grudging admission that female doctors might not be the downfall of civilization after all. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd lost her career in Boston only to build something greater in Timber Creek. She'd hidden her identity only to discover that being herself was her greatest strength. She'd faced disease, prejudice, and organized opposition, emerging scarred, but victorious. "You're thinking deep thoughts again," James observed, settling beside her with Hope in his lap. "I'm thinking about persistence," Margaret replied, "about how the things that seem like endings are really beginnings in disguise." "Your ending in Boston was Timber Creek's beginning," James agreed, "and our beginning." Hope reached for Margaret with chubby hands, babbling something that might have been Mama. Margaret pulled her daughter close, feeling the solid weight of this life she'd built, this future she'd secured not just for herself but for others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be those who believed women shouldn't be doctors, always be diseases to fight, and prejudices to overcome. But tonight, surrounded by family and friends in this unlikely frontier town that had become home, Margaret allowed herself a moment of complete satisfaction. She had come to Timber Creek as a mail-order bride hiding her past as a doctor. She remained as Dr. Margaret Rowland, wife, mother, teacher, and healer, all of herselves integrated into one complete life. The frontier had given her what civilization couldn't, the freedom to be exactly who she was meant to be. The sound of laughter drifted from the hospital where her students were working the evening shift. Somewhere in town, a baby she'd delivered was taking its first breaths. In Denver, the medical college she'd helped design was preparing to accept its first class of female students. The ripples of her choices spread outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching lives she'd never even know. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she'd stepped off that stagecoach years ago. It was infinitely better, messier, harder, more challenging, but also more rewarding than any life she could have planned. The mail-order bride had indeed hidden her past as a doctor, but in revealing that truth, she'd found something more valuable than respectability or convention. She'd found herself. The seasons turned, and with them came changes Margaret hadn't anticipated. Hope grew from a toddling infant into a curious child of 3. Her questions endless, and her fascination with her mother's work evident in the way she played with her dolls, carefully bandaging their imaginary wounds and declaring them all better now, like Mama makes people better. It was on an ordinary Tuesday morning that extraordinary news arrived. Margaret was examining a miner's persistent cough when Sarah burst into the examination room, a telegram clutched in her hand, her face flushed with excitement. "Margaret, you need to read this immediately," she said, barely able to contain herself. The telegram was from Washington, from the newly established National Medical Association. Margaret read it twice before the words fully registered. She was being awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for Medical Innovation, specifically for her work developing the diphtheria antitoxin and establishing preventive care protocols that had been adopted throughout the Western Territories. "They want you to come to Washington to receive it," Sarah continued, "from President Cleveland himself." The miner, forgotten on the examination table, sat up with interest. "Are docs getting a medal from the president?" "Well, I'll be damned." Word spread through Timber Creek like wildfire through dry brush. By evening, the entire town was buzzing with pride and excitement. Their doctor, the woman who'd arrived as a hidden refugee from scandal, was being recognized at the highest levels of government. "You have to go," James insisted that evening as they discussed the invitation. "This isn't just recognition for you, it's validation for every female physician who's been told she doesn't belong. But the practice, the hospital, we'll survive 2 weeks without you. Margaret, you've earned this." The preparations for the trip became a town affair. Mrs. Hartwell organized a committee to ensure Margaret had appropriate attire for Washington society. The Chinese community contributed an elegant silk shawl embroidered with symbols of healing and prosperity. Even the miners took up a collection to help with travel expenses, though Margaret protested she didn't need it. "You saved our lives more times than we can count," Big Tom McKenna said gruffly. "Least we can do is help you get to Washington to get what you deserve." 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in the East Room of the White House, her heart pounding as President Cleveland himself pinned the medal to her dress. The room was full of dignitaries, medical professionals, and journalists, but Margaret's eyes found the small contingent from Timber Creek: James, looking distinguished in his best suit, Dr. Brennan, and Dr. Chen, who'd insisted on coming to witness this moment. And surprisingly, Mrs. Hartwell, who declared nothing would keep her from seeing our Margaret honored properly. "Dr. Rowland," the president said, his voice carrying across the room, "your innovations in frontier medicine have saved countless lives. Your development of diphtheria antitoxin production in primitive conditions showed ingenuity and courage. Your establishment of preventive care protocols has become the model for rural medical practice. But perhaps most importantly, your perseverance in the face of prejudice has opened doors for women in medicine that can never be closed again." The applause was thunderous, but Margaret barely heard it. She was thinking of that desperate night when she'd injected horse serum into dying children, not knowing if it would save or kill them. Of the women who'd died in childbirth before she arrived in Timber Creek. Of William Ashford's betrayal and her flight west. Every moment had led to this one. Every struggle had been a step on this path. After the ceremony, she was approached by Dr. William Osler, one of the most respected physicians in America, who would soon help establish Johns Hopkins Hospital. "Dr. Rowland," he said, studying her with keen interest, "I've read your papers on antiseptic procedures and preventive care. Revolutionary work. Have you considered that your methods could transform medical practice not just in frontier towns, but in major cities?" "I've found, Dr. Osler, that frontier towns are often more willing to embrace change than established cities," Margaret replied. "Necessity makes people practical." "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "but your success suggests that the medical establishment needs to become more practical as well. Would you consider writing a comprehensive text on frontier medicine, something that could be used in medical schools? A textbook, her methods and experiences formalized into teaching material for the next generation." "I would be honored," she said. The Washington trip included meetings with other female physicians from around the country. Margaret found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't realized she was part of. Women who'd been inspired by news of her success in Timber Creek, who'd used her published papers to defend their own practices, who saw her as proof that a woman could succeed in medicine on her own terms. "You don't know me," one young woman said, approaching Margaret after a medical society dinner, but you saved my career. When the board in Philadelphia tried to revoke my license, I cited your case and your published works. They backed down. These encounters happened repeatedly, women sharing stories of how Margaret's example had influenced their lives. It was humbling and overwhelming, making Margaret realize that her fight hadn't been hers alone. It had been for all of them. But the trip wasn't without its shadows. At a reception hosted by the Washington Medical Society, Margaret encountered a familiar face. Dr. Harrison Whitmore from Boston, the man who'd tried to lure her back years ago. "Dr. Rowland," he said stiffly, "I see frontier life has suited you." "It has," she replied evenly. "How is Boston?" "Struggling, actually. We've had 3 epidemics in 2 years. Our mortality rates are embarrassingly high compared to what you've achieved in Colorado." He paused, seeming to wrestle with his pride. "I was wrong to dismiss your work as frontier simplicity. Your methods, we've started implementing some of them." It was as close to an apology as she would get, but it was enough. "Medicine advances when we share knowledge, Dr. Whitmore. I'm glad Boston is benefiting from what we've learned in Timber Creek." The return journey to Colorado felt like a victory march, but Margaret knew the real work awaited her at home. The textbook Dr. Osler had suggested would require months of writing, organizing years of experience into teachable lessons. And there was something else, a secret she'd shared only with James. She was pregnant again, at 41, a dangerous age for childbirth even under the best circumstances. "We could go to Denver for the delivery," James suggested as their train climbed into the mountains. "They have more resources." "I trust my colleagues," Margaret interrupted. "Dr. Chen has delivered hundreds of babies now. If something goes wrong, I'd rather be in familiar hands than among strangers, no matter how well equipped." The pregnancy was indeed difficult. Margaret's body, already weakened by tuberculosis and years of hard work, protested the strain. She was forced to reduce her practice to only the most essential cases, spending more time writing and teaching than actively treating patients. It was during this forced slowdown that she made an unexpected discovery. Anna Ashford, now in her final year of training, brought her a journal from Germany that mentioned new research into a bacterial cause for tuberculosis. "They've identified the actual organism," Anna said excitedly. "Dr. Koch calls it Mycobacterium tuberculosis. If we can identify the organism, maybe we can develop targeted treatments." Margaret read the research with growing excitement. This could change everything about how tuberculosis was treated. She began corresponding with researchers in Berlin, sharing her own observations from her illness and recovery. One of her suggestions about the relationship between nutrition and tuberculosis resistance caught the attention of the international medical community. But her advancing pregnancy made everything harder. At 7 months, she was confined to bed rest after experiencing early contractions. It was torture for someone used to constant activity, but hope provided unexpected comfort, curling up beside her mother to read her picture books while Margaret worked on her textbook. "Tell me about when I was born," Hope demanded one afternoon, a favorite request. "You were born just as the sun came up," Margaret told her, smoothing her daughter's dark curls. "The whole sky turned pink and gold, as if celebrating your arrival. Was I very small?" "Perfect sized. And you had the strongest grip. You held onto my finger and wouldn't let go." "Like baby will do?" Margaret touched her swollen belly. "Yes, like your brother or sister will do." The labor began on a November night when the first heavy snow of winter was falling. Margaret had been right to trust her colleagues. Dr. Chen took charge with calm efficiency while Dr. Brennan assisted and Sarah monitored Margaret's vital signs. Even Anna was there, learning from this most personal of medical experiences. "You're the worst patient I've ever had," Dr. Chen said during a break between contractions. "Stop trying to diagnose yourself and just breathe." The baby, another daughter, was born just before dawn, smaller than Hope had been, but with the same strong lungs and determined grip. Margaret, exhausted but euphoric, examined her new daughter with wonder. Despite her age and health challenges, she'd created another perfect life. "What will you name her?" Sarah asked, cleaning the infant with practiced gentleness. Margaret looked at James, who was holding Hope up to see her new sister. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the morning sun was turning the mountains into crystalline sculptures of light and shadow. "Grace," she said. Grace Elizabeth Rowland, for the grace that brought us through everything. The recovery was slower this time. Margaret's body, pushed to its limits, took weeks to regain strength. But the forced rest allowed her to finish her textbook, Frontier Medicine, a practical guide, which would become the standard reference for rural medical practice for the next generation. As winter deepened, a new challenge emerged. The railroad company, expanding its operations, wanted to build a new line that would cut directly through Timber Creek's water source. The potential for contamination was enormous. Margaret had seen what industrial pollution could do to water supplies in eastern cities. "They have government backing," Mayor Thompson said grimly during an emergency town meeting. "Federal support for western expansion. Fighting them could ruin the town financially. And not fighting them could ruin the town literally," Margaret countered. "Contaminated water means disease. We've worked too hard to prevent epidemics to invite one in." The battle that followed tested Margaret's influence and connections. She mobilized the medical community throughout the territory, presenting evidence of health disasters in other towns where industrial expansion had contaminated water supplies. She wrote articles for Eastern newspapers, using her new fame to draw attention to the threat. But it was Hope who provided the unexpected solution. During a town meeting where railroad representatives were presenting their plans, Hope escaped from James's lap and toddled to the front of the room. "My mama saves people," she announced to the surprised officials. "She won't let you hurt our water." The innocence of the child's statement, combined with Margaret's presentation of medical evidence, swayed public opinion decisively. The railroad was forced to reroute, preserving Timber Creek's water supply. Spring brought a delegation from the newly established University of Colorado. They wanted Margaret to teach to establish a rural medicine program that would train doctors specifically for frontier practice. "We can't match what you've built in Timber Creek," the dean admitted, "but we can spread your methods to dozens of new doctors every year." Margaret was tempted, but looking at her life, her practice, her colleagues, her community, her daughters playing in the garden, she knew her answer. "I'll consult," she offered. "I'll help design the program, guest lecture, take advanced students for residencies. But my home is here." The dean was disappointed but not surprised. "We expected as much. You've built something unique here, Dr. Rowland. We just hope you'll help us replicate it elsewhere." That summer brought a full-circle moment. Lucy Morrison, now doctor. Lucy Morrison returned to Timber Creek to establish her own practice. She was one of the youngest female physicians in the country, brilliant and confident in ways Margaret had only dreamed of being at that age. "None of this would have been possible without you," Lucy said, as Margaret showed her around the expanded hospital. "You didn't just teach me medicine. You taught me that being a woman in medicine wasn't something to overcome, but something that made me better at healing." The practice grew to include 5 doctors: Margaret, Brennan, Chen, Lucy, and surprisingly, a young Shoshone man named Joseph White Eagle, who'd trained in Chicago and wanted to serve both Native and white communities. Margaret's role evolved from primary physician to senior consultant and teacher, her body no longer able to maintain the punishing pace of frontier medicine, but her mind still sharp and innovative. It was while reviewing cases one autumn afternoon that Margaret noticed a pattern. Several children from mining families were showing similar symptoms: stunted growth, cognitive delays, behavioral problems. Her investigations revealed lead poisoning from mine tailings contaminating home gardens. The discovery led to another battle with mine owners, but Margaret had learned how to wage such wars. She documented everything meticulously, published her findings in medical journals, and mobilized both medical and public opinion. The mines were forced to implement new safety measures and pay for medical treatment for affected children. "You never stop fighting, do you?" James said one evening as Margaret worked on yet another article about industrial health hazards. "How can I? Every battle we win saves lives, maybe for generations." "I know, it's one of the things I love most about you, but you need to take care of yourself too." He was right. Margaret's health was increasingly fragile. The tuberculosis, while controlled, had damaged her lungs permanently. The 2 difficult pregnancies had taken their toll. She was often exhausted by midday, her hands sometimes shaking too much for delicate work, but there were compensations. Hope, now 6, showed every sign of following in her mother's footsteps, already reading medical texts and asking questions that showed remarkable understanding. Grace, at 2, was a bundle of energy who brought joy to everyone around her. The hospital had grown to 40 beds with a proper surgical suite and laboratory. The medical school program she'd helped design was producing doctors trained specifically for rural practice. One October evening, as the aspens turned gold on the mountainsides, Margaret received a letter that made her hands tremble. It was from the Nobel Committee in Stockholm. Her work on diphtheria antitoxin, combined with her innovations in preventive care, was being considered for the Nobel Prize in Medicine. "It's just consideration," she told James, trying to contain her excitement. "Hundreds are considered." "But how many are frontier doctors from Colorado? How many are women?" The answer was none. If Margaret won, she would be the first woman to receive a Nobel Prize in any field. The possibility was dizzying and terrifying. The waiting was agony. Months passed with no word. Margaret threw herself into work to distract herself, establishing a new program to train midwives from the immigrant communities flooding into Colorado with the mining boom. Then, on a snowy December morning, the telegram arrived. Sarah brought it to Margaret with shaking hands, having recognized the international origin. Margaret read it 3 times before the words sank in. She had won. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for 1889 would go to Dr. Margaret Rowland for her pioneering work in antitoxin development and establishment of preventive care protocols that have saved countless lives. The news exploded across the country. Timber Creek found itself at the center of international attention. Journalists flooded the town, eager to understand how a frontier settlement had produced a Nobel laureate. "This isn't just my prize," Margaret told the crowd gathered outside the hospital. "It belongs to everyone who believed a woman could be a doctor, everyone who trusted me with their lives when society said they shouldn't, everyone who fought beside me for better health care. This prize belongs to Timber Creek." The trip to Stockholm was a world away from anything Margaret had experienced. Kings and queens, scientists and scholars, all gathered to celebrate human achievement. But standing at the podium in the Golden Hall, Margaret thought not of glory, but of the journey. The desperate flight from Boston, the terrified woman hiding her skills, the first baby she'd delivered in Timber Creek, the children saved by horse serum and hope. "Medicine," she said in her acceptance speech, "advances not in the great hospitals of capital cities, but wherever someone refuses to accept that suffering is inevitable. It progresses when we remember that healing is not about authority or tradition, but about observation, innovation, and compassion. I learned this not in the halls of medical schools, but in a frontier town where necessity made revolutionaries of us all." The return to Timber Creek was bittersweet. The fame brought opportunities, but also obligations. Margaret found herself pulled in many directions: lectures, consultations, endless correspondence. But she was determined not to let fame separate her from the work that mattered. She established the Rowland Foundation with her prize money, dedicated to training female physicians and providing medical care to underserved communities. The first recipient was a young black woman from Mississippi who'd been rejected by every medical school despite exceptional qualifications. "They said I was doubly cursed," the young woman Martha Washington said when she arrived in Timber Creek. "Black and female. They said I'd never be a doctor." "They said the same about me, just with different words," Margaret replied. "Prove them wrong as I did." As Margaret aged, her body increasingly fragile but her spirit undimmed, she watched the seed she'd planted bloom into a garden of change. Female physicians were no longer rarities, but increasingly common, especially in the West. Her textbook was in its 3rd edition, used in medical schools across the country. The preventive care protocols she'd pioneered had become standard practice, but it was the personal victories that mattered most. Hope, at 16, was accepted early to medical school, her brilliance undeniable. Grace showed more interest in law, declaring she would fight for people like Mama does, but with words instead of medicines. James's hair had gone completely silver, but his love remained as steady as the mountains surrounding their town. One spring evening, as Margaret sat in her garden watching her daughters help Dr. Lucy with a difficult delivery at the hospital, she felt a deep sense of completion. The mail-order bride who'd hidden her past had become not just a doctor, but a symbol of what was possible when courage met opportunity. "Any regrets now?" James asked, settling beside her as he had so many evenings over the years. Margaret thought of all the paths not taken, the life she might have had in Boston if William Ashford hadn't betrayed her, the prestigious position she'd turned down to stay in Timber Creek. "How could I regret the life that gave me everything?" she replied. "I came here to hide and instead found myself. I thought I was ending my medical career and instead revolutionized it. I expected loneliness and found love, community, purpose." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret knew her story was nearing its end. The tuberculosis, dormant for years, was stirring again. She could feel it in her labored breathing, her persistent fever. But there was no fear, only gratitude for the unexpected life she'd lived. She had one last lesson to teach, one final contribution to make. Over the following months, she documented everything, not just medical procedures, but the human side of frontier medicine. The fears and triumphs, the failures that led to innovations, the prejudices overcome and battles fought. It would become her final gift to the world, a memoir that would inspire generations of physicians, especially women, to persist despite obstacles. The end came on a September morning when the aspens were just beginning to turn. Margaret woke to find her family gathered around her bed, James holding her hand, Hope and Grace on either side, her colleagues and friends filling the room. "Did we win?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, my love," James replied, understanding she meant more than any single battle. "We won everything that mattered." Margaret smiled, thinking of that frightened woman stepping off the stagecoach so many years ago, carrying secrets and shame. That woman could never have imagined this ending, surrounded by love, celebrated for her achievements, having changed the world not by hiding who she was, but by revealing it fully. As her breathing slowed, she heard Hope reading from her medical texts to Grace, explaining how their mother had revolutionized antiseptic procedures. She heard the bustle of the hospital next door, where lives were being saved using methods she'd developed. She heard the voices of all the women who'd become doctors because she'd shown it was possible. The mail-order bride had hidden her past as a doctor, but in revealing that truth, she'd created a future where such hiding would never be necessary again. The frontier town had learned the truth when the epidemic broke, but that revelation had broken more than disease. It had broken barriers that had stood for centuries. Margaret Rowland, née Hale, died as she had lived in Timber Creek, surrounded by those she'd healed, taught, and loved. Her last thought was not of the Nobel Prize or the textbooks bearing her name or the medical procedures that would save countless lives. It was of a simple truth. She had been exactly who she was meant to be, and that had been enough to change everything. The funeral brought thousands to Timber Creek. Medical dignitaries, former patients, students she'd trained, women she'd inspired. But it was Doc Morrison, now 90 and barely able to stand, who gave the eulogy that captured her best. "Margaret Rowland came to us as a secret," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "She left us as a legacy. She taught us that healing isn't about degrees or recognition, but about seeing suffering and refusing to accept it. She showed us that the truth, however difficult, is always better than a comfortable lie. And she proved that one person, being fully themselves, can change not just a town, but the world." As they laid her to rest in the Timber Creek Cemetery, overlooking the valley she'd made her home and the mountains that had witnessed her transformation, the town's bells rang out, not in mourning, but in celebration. The mail-order bride who had hidden her past as a doctor had become Dr. Margaret Rowland, and in doing so had shown everyone that the greatest epidemic of all was the disease of limiting human potential based on prejudice and fear. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription, Dr. Margaret Rowland, 1846 to 1889. She healed bodies and changed minds. But her true monument was in every female physician who practiced freely, every frontier town with proper medical care, every child who lived because of the treatments she'd pioneered. The epidemic had indeed broken out that day so many years ago, but it wasn't disease, it was truth, spreading inexorably until the whole world was transformed. Hope Rowland would go on to become one of America's most celebrated physicians, continuing her mother's work. Grace would become a Supreme Court justice, fighting for equality with the same passion her mother had brought to medicine. James would live another decade, maintaining Margaret's garden and sharing stories of the remarkable woman who'd answered his mail-order bride advertisement and exceeded every possible dream. And in Timber Creek, forever after, whenever someone faced an impossible challenge, they would say, "Remember Dr. Margaret? She came here to hide and instead taught us all how to be brave."